Hey guys, tonight we're drifting back into the smoke and salt of the early 1600s, into the strange true story of a Kentish fish gutter who deserted the English Navy with about 30 other men, stole a boat barely bigger than a rowboat with ambition, and ended up commanding a 60-gun warship, a private fortune historians still argue was worth somewhere between £500,000 and £2 million, and a reputation so enormous that London street balladeers were singing about him before he'd even turned 40. We're talking about drunken brawls in a foreign court, a fortune built on the biggest single prize any English pirate ever took, a pardon offered and cruelly withdrawn, a religious conversion that scandalised an entire kingdom, and, according to one very persistent modern claim, the actual real-world seed of Captain Jack Sparrow himself. Welcome to the life of John Ward, sometimes called Jack, sometimes called Birdie, and by the end of his life called Yusuf Race, a man 3 separate governments wanted dead, and who, by most accounts, simply grew old instead. Go ahead and get comfortable. Dim the lights if you can. Maybe let a fan hum low in the background, something that could pass if you squint your ears for wind dragging through rigging or the far-off hush of surf on a limestone quay. You're warm right now, wrapped in something soft, in a room that isn't going anywhere. That won't be true for most of the people in this story. Some of them are about to spend the next several hours crammed below a foreign deck, or standing in a slave market being looked over like livestock, or lying awake in a mud-walled room in Tunis, wondering if the money they sent home ever arrived. You get to just listen. So let's ease into tonight's journey together, 4 centuries back, to a small fishing town on the edge of the English Channel, where all of this, the guns, the gold, the axe, the birds, started with a boy who smelled permanently of herring. The smoke had not even cleared from the first volley when the carpenter of the Reniere Sodorina turned to his captain and told him, quietly, that the crew would not fight much longer. It was the 26th of April, 1607, somewhere in the stretch of water between Cyprus and the Turkish coast, and the Sodorina was, by any reasonable measure, one of the largest merchant vessels afloat in the Mediterranean that spring. A Venetian argosy of 14 or 1500 tons, so heavy with cotton, silk, indigo, and other cargo out of Aleppo that English officials back home would later value the haul at roughly £500,000, while the pamphlet writer who first broke the story to London readers insisted the real number was closer to 2 million. Bearing down on her were 2 ships that should not, by any sane calculation, have dared the attempt. The Gift, 200 tons, and the Ruby, 400, together barely a third of the Sodorina's bulk. For 3 hours the smaller ships used the only advantage they had, the wind which the giant argosy could barely answer, to circle and pour chain shot into her hull, tearing 5 holes clean through her sides and setting fire to the loose cotton bales her own crew had dragged up from the hold for cover. 2 Venetian sailors were killed outright by a single shot. That was the moment the carpenter spoke up. That was the moment the Sodorina's captain, weighing a burning ship against a Venetian crew's appetite for a fight they were plainly losing, gave the order to strike her colours. This is the story of John Ward, the fisherman who became an admiral, the deserter who became a diplomat's headache, and, according to a few modern historians who have gone looking, quite possibly the seed of the name behind the most famous fictional pirate of the 21st century. The man giving the orders on the other side of that exchange of cannon fire was, by then, already the most talked about Englishman on the water, a 50-something former fisherman from a town most of his own crew had never heard of, who thought he was, in that moment, becoming the wealthiest pirate the world had yet produced. We'll come back to this exact afternoon, because it deserves the full account it's going to get. But to understand how a Kentish boy who once gutted fish for a living ended up ordering chain shot into the largest ship in the Eastern Mediterranean, we have to go back nearly 20 years to a different war entirely, and a very different kind of Englishman altogether. Faversham, Kent, sat on a tidal creek about 10 miles from Canterbury, and in the second half of the 16th century it was the kind of town that produced 2 things in equal measure: fish and rumour. John Ward was born there around 1553. The date is approximate, drawn from later depositions rather than any surviving parish register. So treat it the way you'd treat any birth date from a family that didn't own a Bible worth writing in. He grew up, by every surviving account, unremarkably. He worked the fisheries, the way half the boys on that stretch of coast did, hauling nets and gutting catch in a trade that guaranteed you calloused hands, a permanent smell of brine, and, if you were unlucky, an early grave and a boat that never came back. Nothing about Ward's childhood marked him out. He wasn't the son of a merchant or a minor gentleman fallen on hard times, the way some pirates were. He was simply a fisherman's boy in a fishing town, and there is no reason to think he expected his life to be anything other than exactly that. Then, in 1588, Spain sent an armada to invade England, and every port town on the Channel coast got pulled, whether it liked it or not, into a war economy. Here's the thing about Elizabethan England and Spain. After the Armada's defeat, Queen Elizabeth didn't have the money to fight Spain with a standing royal fleet, so she did the next best thing. She sold licenses. A letter of marque cost you paperwork and a cut of the take, and in exchange you got legal cover to attack Spanish shipping, seize the cargo, and keep a share for yourself, with the crown taking its portion off the top. It was privateering, and for an ambitious young man with some boat handling experience and no fortune to lose, it was the single best career opportunity the English coast had ever produced. Ward, by most reconstructions of his life, spent these years working his way through this world, first perhaps in the Navy itself, later in the semi-official grey zone of privateering against Spanish shipping, the trade that would have paid a fisherman's son more in one lucky prize than a decade of honest netting ever could. And then, in 1603, Elizabeth died, James I inherited the throne, and one of his very first acts as king was to make peace with Spain. Overnight, the entire privateering economy that had employed thousands of English sailors simply stopped existing. No more letters of marque, no more legal Spanish prizes, no more cover. For a young king trying to present himself as a peacemaker to the courts of Europe, ending the war was smart diplomacy. For every sailor who had spent 15 years learning no trade except how to chase, board and plunder a merchant ship, it was a catastrophe. And it left men like Ward with a choice that wasn't really much of a choice at all: go back to hauling nets for wages a fraction of what a single prize used to pay, or keep doing exactly what they'd been doing, just without the paperwork that used to make it legal. According to the fullest surviving account of what happened next, a pamphlet written years later by a man with every reason to exaggerate, which we'll get to, Ward was, by 1603, serving unhappily in the Royal Navy, placed aboard a ship called the Lion's Whelp in the Channel Squadron. 2 weeks in, he and roughly 30 other men had had enough. They deserted together, stole a small 25-ton bark, and set out on their own account, with no licence, no crown to answer to, and nothing to lose that they hadn't already lost. Their first target off the Isle of Wight was a ship called the Violet, rumoured to be carrying treasure belonging to Catholic refugees fleeing England. It turned out, on capture, to be carrying nothing of the sort, a deflating, almost comic start to what would become one of the most profitable criminal careers of the century. Here's the thing about pirate origin stories. They rarely start with the big score. They start with a tiny stolen boat and a disappointing first prize, and Ward's was no exception. Here's a distinction worth pausing on, because the whole rest of Ward's story hinges on it. The words privateer, pirate and corsair all describe more or less the same activity: chasing down a ship, taking it by force, keeping what's aboard. But only one of them was, at any given moment, legal. A privateer had paperwork. A pirate didn't. A corsair was the word used, mostly by outsiders, for men who operated under the protection of a Muslim ruler on the Barbary coast, legal in their own harbour, condemned everywhere else. Ward would eventually hold all three titles across the span of about a decade, sometimes switching between them within the same voyage, which tells you less about Ward's character than about how thin the line really was in this period between a state-sanctioned sailor and a wanted man. The paperwork was the only thing that ever separated them, and paperwork, as Ward discovered in 1603, could be revoked with a single royal signature. What Ward and his small crew did have, even from that unglamorous beginning, was a plan bigger than robbing coastal shipping in the Channel, where English patrol ships would eventually catch up with them. The real money and the real safety lay south, in the Mediterranean, where a pirate with enough guns and enough nerve could find a friendly port willing to look the other way, take a cut, and let him operate as something closer to a licensed corsair than a hunted outlaw. Ward first tried Algiers and was turned away. The city already had more renegade captains angling for a berth than it wanted to manage. So in 1605 he tried Tunis instead, and there he found Uthman Dey, the Janissary commander who had effectively supplanted the old Ottoman-appointed governor and ruled the city as its military strongman. The terms Ward struck with him were simple and, from a business standpoint, almost elegant. Uthman Dey would get first refusal on all captured goods, up to 10% of the total haul, in exchange for the use of Tunis and its harbour at La Goulette as a home port. Two men who had never met a week before now had a partnership that would make them both extraordinarily rich, and would eventually drag half of Catholic Europe's navies into the argument. We actually know something about what Ward and his men looked like arriving at that harbour for the first time, because Tunis required every foreign vessel to put in first at La Goulette, the fortified outer port, where customs officials and local merchants gathered at the quay to size up whoever had just sailed in. Picture it, heavily bearded Englishmen with long, unwashed hair hanging out from under-knitted Monmouth caps, dressed in a scavenged, mismatched wardrobe of stolen velvet jackets, leather jerkins, and whatever armour they'd looted off a dead or surrendered crew. Stepping ashore into a city of turbaned artisans, veiled women and Janissary soldiers in vivid woolen coats and gold-banded hats. Neither side had any idea, yet, what to make of the other. The Janissaries had seen plenty of Christian sailors before, but not usually ones asking, politely, whether the city might like to go into business with them. Ward's men, for their part, were fishermen and deserters and channel smugglers who had never in their lives seen a mosque, a minaret, or a harbour this alive with a language they couldn't speak a word of. Nobody in that crowd on the quay in 1605 could have guessed that the short, balding Englishman doing the talking would, within 2 years, be richer than most of the merchants watching him. Word of what Ward was building travelled slower than Ward himself did, which worked entirely in his favour. It was the summer of 1608, over a year after his arrangement with Uthman Dey had already made him wealthy, before an Englishman named Henry Pepwell walked into the private residence of Sir Henry Wotton, James I's ambassador in Venice, fresh off a trip to Tunis, to deliver the first detailed intelligence report the English government had on their runaway pirate. Pepwell described a criminal career that had started with one stolen ship on the south coast of England and grown in the years since into a full pirate fleet with a formal base of operations and a foreign patron. He reported, with evident alarm, that Ward's ships were now pointed toward the Straits of Gibraltar and the open Atlantic, and that the captain had reportedly vowed to spare no one he could defeat. Officials in London and Venice had spent 2 years chasing rumours. Now for the first time, they had a name, a base, and a business partner to attach to the man who was about to become, in the words of one Venetian diplomat writing not long after, the greatest scoundrel that had ever sailed out of England. By the time you could call Ward's operation a fleet, rather than a single stolen bark, the pattern of his rise had become almost mechanical, each capture funding the next, each prize adding a ship to his growing squadron. In November of 1606, Ward's men took an English merchantman, the John Baptist, under a Captain John Key, and in a small, almost sentimental touch for a man about to become one of the most feared names on the sea, Ward renamed her Little John, after the English folk hero's faithful companion. Days later, on the 16th of November, his lieutenant William Graves brought in a much richer prize, the Venetian ship Ruby. By the 28th of January 1607, they'd added the Carminati, another Venetian vessel, to the growing collection. 4 ships now flew, unofficially, quietly, but unmistakably, under Ward's command, the Gift, the Little John, the Ruby, the Carminati. A fisherman's son who had deserted the navy with a stolen rowboat's worth of ambition now had a private navy of his own, and letters were already crossing the desks of English and Venetian officials asking, with real alarm, who exactly this Captain Ward was, and how quickly he could be stopped. It helps to understand why Uthman Dey wanted men like Ward in the first place, because the arrangement wasn't charity. Tunis, like Algiers and Tripoli further along the coast, was nominally part of the Ottoman Empire, but functioned, in practice, as its own semi-independent statelet, and its economy ran heavily on the plunder its corsair fleets brought home. A skilled European captain, familiar with Atlantic-style sailing ships rather than the all-powered galleys that had dominated Mediterranean warfare for centuries, was a genuine military asset, someone who could take the fight further from home against richer targets than the local fleet had previously managed. Uthman Dey wasn't recruiting a criminal. From where he was sitting, he was recruiting a naval contractor with an unusually good ursum, and Ward's 10% arrangement was, by the standards of the age, a fairly ordinary piece of statecraft. The English crown had done more or less the same thing with its own privateers for the better part of 2 decades. Uthman Dey had simply figured out that Ward's skills didn't stop being useful just because the English king had decided they were illegal. The economics of it, for an ordinary sailor rather than a captain, are worth sitting with for a moment, because they explain why men kept flocking to Ward's growing fleet, even as the price on his head grew with each captured ship. A common seaman in the Royal Navy in these years could expect roughly 10 shillings a month, paid late and often not paid in full at all. English naval pay was notoriously unreliable in this period, with wages sometimes owed for years before the Crown settled its debts. A single decent prize, split among a pirate crew by an agreed share, could put more coin in a common sailor's pocket in one afternoon than 8 months of honest naval service. That arithmetic did the recruiting for Ward far more effectively than any speech he could have given. It also explains something people tend to miss about crews like his. They weren't a gang of romantic outlaws bound by loyalty to their captain. They were, in the plainest sense, migrant labourers who had found an employer offering better wages than the legal alternative, and if a captain stopped delivering, in this period just as in the later Golden Age of Piracy a century on, a crew's confidence in him could evaporate fast. One of the men who would soon find himself relieved of both his ship and its cargo by Ward's Lieutenant William Graves was an English captain named Andrew Barker, and Barker would go on to write the single most detailed account we have of these years, born entirely out of the grudge Ward's men were about to hand him. We'll spend more time with Barker later. For now, just remember the name. Ward was far from alone in making this choice, which is part of why the English government found the problem so hard to contain. By 1608, English deserters and disaffected privateers were turning up as corsairs and renegades all along the Barbary coast, from Sal on the Atlantic side to Algiers, Tunis and Tripoli in the Mediterranean proper. Enough of them that historians now use a specific phrase, Anglo-Turkish piracy, to describe the whole loose network of English captains operating out of Muslim ports in these years. Ward was simply the biggest and the earliest of them to become a household name back home. But he wasn't a lone wolf. He was the leading edge of an entire labour migration, driven by the same peace treaty that had ended his own naval career, in which England's surplus of unemployed, unpaid, half-trained sea warriors went looking for the only trade they knew. Wherever in the world someone would still pay for it. And here is a detail easy to lose in all the cannon fire and the 10% arrangements and the growing fleet of stolen ships. Ward had a wife back in England. We don't know her name. We don't know what she was told, or when, about why her husband had stopped sending letters from the Channel Squadron and started instead sending money from somewhere much farther away. What we do know, because it survives in the record, stated plainly by people who had no reason to be kind towards memory, is that he kept sending that money, for years, long after he had left England for good, long after most men in his position would have simply let an old life go quiet and unremarked. It is a small, strange thread of ordinary decency running through the middle of a story that is, in almost every other respect, about violence and greed, and a man building himself a small empire on other people's cargo. Hold on to that thread. It's going to reappear, and in a story this loud, it's the quiet details that tend to matter most. In the early spring of 1607, Ward outfitted his 4 ships for a major cruise into the Adriatic, hunting for the kind of prize that would turn a successful pirate into a legendary one. A storm scattered the fleet before they ever reached their hunting ground, leaving Ward aboard the Gift, with only the Ruby still in company as he turned east instead. Toward the waters between Cyprus and the Turkish mainland, waters that, on the 26th of April, would put the largest ship most of his crew had ever seen directly across his bow. What happened next would make Ward's name, nearly start a war between 2 Christian kingdoms, and very nearly sink his entire operation before it had properly begun. But that story, the ship that made him and the ship that very nearly finished him, is going to need a chapter of its own to do it justice. For now, know only this: the fisherman's boy from Faversham was no longer anyone's fisherman's boy. He had become, in the space of about 4 years, the single name every merchant captain in the Mediterranean feared most. And he was only getting started. The pirate who was building an empire on other men's cargo needed hands to do it, and not every one of those hands came aboard willingly. Before we go any further with Ward himself, it's worth climbing down into the world of the men who actually hauled his sails and fired his guns, because their story looks nothing like his, and losing sight of that difference is how you end up romanticising a business that, for most of the people in it, was simply dangerous, underpaid, and very far from home. You smell the ship before you see her properly, tar and brine and the faint rot of bilge water, carried up out of the hold on a breeze that hasn't decided yet whether it's spring or winter. It's early 1606, a grey morning at a small West Country harbour whose name won't survive in any record, and you're 19, maybe 20, standing on a dock that smells like every other dock you've ever worked, telling yourself this is just another berth. A recruiter for one of Ward's captains has been through the alehouses all week, talking not about piracy, nobody uses that word out loud, but about a merchant voyage south, good shares, a captain who pays out fair. You've heard enough dockside talk to guess what kind of voyage this really is. You sign on anyway. 10 shillings a month in the Navy, when the Navy remembers to pay you at all, against a share of whatever this ship takes. It isn't much of a choice when your alternative is watching your own children go hungry through another Kentish winter. You tell yourself you're a sailor taking honest work. Congratulations, by the time this ship clears the harbour mouth, English law will call you a pirate, whether you've ever fired a shot or not. The man standing next to you at the rail, tying off a coil of rope with hands that clearly know the work, introduces himself as Toby Rundle, a Cornishman from somewhere near Fowey, missing the top joint of one finger to a fishing accident he describes, cheerfully, in more detail than you asked for. Toby has been to sea since he was 12. He has a habit, you'll notice within the first day, of humming the same 3 bars of a psalm tune under his breath whenever the work gets hard or the weather turns, not out of piety exactly, he tells you later, but because his mother used to hum it over the washing, and it's the closest thing to home he can carry in his head. You will spend the better part of the next 2 years within arm's reach of Toby Rundle. Remember him. Not every name on a ship like this one survives to be written down anywhere, but his fate, when it comes, is going to matter more than any tally of captured cargo. Life below deck settles into a rhythm faster than you expect. Watches run 4 hours on, 4 off, day and night, in a rotation that leaves you perpetually half asleep and never quite sure what hour it actually is. Meals are salt beef gone grey at the edges, ship's biscuit you learn to tap against the table first to knock the weevils loose before you eat it, and a thin, sour small beer that's safer to drink than the water, which has usually gone brackish in the cask within a fortnight. There is no formal written code aboard a ship like this one in 1606. The elaborate signed articles that pirate crews would draw up a century later with their fixed compensation scales for a lost eye or a severed hand, don't exist yet in that form. But the custom that would eventually harden into those written articles is already alive in spirit here. Plunder gets divided by an agreed share. The captain answers to the men who follow him, and a captain who stops delivering prizes or starts dividing them unfairly is a captain who can find himself quietly, firmly replaced. Here's the thing nobody tells you about pirate discipline. It is, in its own way, stricter than anything you left behind on land. Fighting among the crew, theft from a shipmate, sleeping through your watch, all of it is punished, sometimes brutally, because a ship this size, this far from any friendly port, cannot afford the chaos that unpoliced grudges would create. You learn quickly that the freedom people imagine when they picture a pirate ship is mostly freedom from the crown, not freedom from consequence. The rats you learn to live with. The lice you learn to live with. The screaming boredom of a becalmed afternoon, sails hanging slack, nothing to do but mend rope you've already mended twice. You learn, eventually, to live with too, though Toby's psalm tune gets a great deal of use on those days. By your 6th week aboard, the coastline of England is a memory, and the Bay of Biscay has already tried, twice, to kill everyone on the ship. You've been seasick in a way that makes you genuinely wonder if you're dying, which the older hands find endlessly cruelly funny. You've watched a topman lose his footing in a squall and catch himself one-handed on a line, laughing about it afterward in a way that makes your stomach turn worse than the swell did. You are, by any honest measure, terrified most of the time, and too proud to say so. This is the part of pirate life the ballads never bother with. Not the gold, not the flag, just the sheer physical grind of learning to live on a floating wooden box with 80 other frightened men, all of you pretending, for each other's sake, that you aren't frightened at all. Superstition fills the gaps that discipline and routine don't cover, and you learn the ship's particular set within your first month aboard. Nobody whistles on deck, whistling, the old hands insist, calls up wind you don't want, the kind that arrives as a gale rather than a breeze. A ship that changes her name, as the Little John did when Ward's crew renamed her from the captured John Baptist, is supposed to require a small ceremony to appease whatever ill luck the old name might otherwise carry off with it into the new one. And you notice the men who sailed on her original capture are quietly, superstitiously glad they aren't aboard her anymore. There's a boy of perhaps 13 named Davy, ship's servant to the gunner, who brings news around the lower deck the way a town crier might, who's been flogged, whose watch drew the short straw for the worst duty, whether the captain's in a foul temper today. Half of what you know about the state of the ship at any given moment, you know because Davy told you first, second hand, breathless, before the officers ever bothered to make an announcement. It is, you realise, the same way news has always travelled on a ship too large for every man to see everything himself, not from above, but sideways, sailor to sailor, in whatever spare minute the watch allows. 3 weeks out from Gibraltar, having threaded the strait and turned east into waters none of the West Country men aboard have ever sailed before, the cry finally comes down from the masthead that every man on board has been waiting for and dreading in equal measure: sail, 2 points off the starboard bow. What happens over the next several hours is going to be the first time you find out, in the most literal sense possible, what you actually signed up for. The chase itself is almost anticlimactic. Hours of trimming sail, of the quartermaster shouting course corrections, of watching a smudge on the horizon slowly resolve into a merchantman flying colours nobody aboard particularly respects. It's the last 20 minutes before contact that turn your stomach to water. Gun crews clear their pieces. Boarding axes and cutlasses come up from below, passed hand to hand along the deck. Toby Rundle, next to you at the rail, has stopped humming entirely, and that silence frightens you more than any noise could have. The merchant captain, outgunned and clearly aware of it, strikes his colours before a single shot is fired, the smartest possible decision, and also the single greatest anticlimax of your entire short career as a criminal. You board a ship whose crew is too frightened to resist, and you understand, standing on her deck with a boarding axe you never had to use, that you have just committed an act of piracy that will be discussed with real fear in 3 different capital cities, and that it took less violence than a bad night at a dockside tavern back home. Discipline aboard is enforced by threat more often than by its actual use, which is precisely why the threat works. A man caught stealing from a shipmate's sea chest can expect to be lashed to the mast and flogged in front of the entire crew, a punishment you watch carried out exactly once in your time aboard, on a Dutchman who'd taken another man's boots, and the sound of it is enough that you never once consider testing the rule yourself. The older hands talk, in the low, half-joking way sailors discuss the worst things they've witnessed, about keel hauling, dragging a man under the ship's hull on a rope, from one side to the other, through barnacles that will flay skin to the bone if the victim survives the lack of air at all. Though whether it's ever actually used aboard your own ship, or only invoked as a story to frighten new hands like you, nobody will say for certain, and you're not eager to find out which. What you do witness, twice, is a much quieter form of justice, a man whose cowardice in a skirmish endangered the rest of the crew simply finding himself, at the next port, no longer welcome aboard, put ashore with nothing, left to find his own way home or his own way into some other captain's crew. On a ship this far from any law but its own, exile turns out to be a more common sentence than the noose. By your second prize taken, the anticlimax has worn off, and the arithmetic has set in instead. Plunder gets tallied, the captain and Uthman Day's 10% set aside first, officers' larger shares counted out next, and what's left divided among the common hands, you and Toby included. It is, by any standard you grew up with, an enormous sum, more coin than either of you has ever held at once. It is also, you notice, considerably less than the captain's share, and less still than what the pamphlets back in London will eventually claim every pirate crew hauls in. The gap between the legend of pirate riches and the actual coin that reaches a common sailor's palm is one of the best kept secrets of this entire trade, and you are one of the very few people who will ever know it firsthand. Not every sail on the horizon means a prize, and by your 4th month in these waters you've learned to dread the ones that don't. Twice now the cry from the masthead has brought not the scramble of an approaching capture, but a colder, quieter kind of urgency. A ship too well armed, too disciplined in her approach, flying colours that mean patrol rather than trade. The first time, a suspected Venetian war galley forces a full day's hard sailing to shake, everyone on deck watching the horizon in shifts, long after she's out of sight, certain she'll reappear at any moment. The second time, word passes below that the sail belongs to an English king's ship, out hunting the very men whose desertion started this whole voyage, and for a few hours the strange, upside-down truth of your situation sinks in fully. The navy you once served now wants you hanged, and the only safety you have left lies 600 miles away, in a Muslim port ruled by a man your own king would call an infidel. You are, in the space of one bad afternoon, reminded that piracy is not simply a life of freedom bought with someone else's cargo. It is also a life spent permanently, unglamorously, one unlucky sighting away from a rope. Within a year of that first stolen bark putting to sea, your ship has taken 3 more prizes, weathered one storm bad enough that you genuinely composed, in your head, the words you'd want said over you if you drowned, and buried 2 men, one to a fever nobody could name, one to a fall from the rigging that Toby Rundle still won't talk about, because he was standing directly beneath when it happened. The storm is worth pausing on, because it very nearly took you both. Green water came over the rail in the dark. The ship rolled further than any of the old hands claimed they'd ever felt her roll and live, and for about 4 minutes, gripping a line with hands you could no longer feel, you were entirely certain this was how your story ended. It wasn't a shot or a blade that nearly killed you on a pirate ship. It was ordinary weather, the same weather that has always been the true enemy of every sailor who ever lived, criminal or honest. Toby's own injury comes not in a boarding action, but in the unglamorous business of careening the ship, hauling her over on a beach to scrape barnacles and rot from her hull, when a shifting timber crushes 2 fingers on his good hand past saving. There is no ship surgeon aboard with any real training, there rarely is, on a vessel this size in this period. The quartermaster does what he can with a knife, a hot iron, and a swallow of the strongest spirits aboard, and Toby comes through it feverish but alive, missing most of 2 fingers and unable, for weeks, to do more than watch the rest of you work. What happens next is the detail worth sitting with the crew, without any written article requiring it, without anyone forcing the issue. Sets aside an extra share of the next prize for him anyway, not out of sentiment exactly, but because every man aboard understands that it could just as easily have been his own hand crushed under that timber, and the custom of compensating a man maimed in the ship's service, however informal it is here in 1607, is already the thing that makes 80 frightened strangers willing to trust each other with their lives. It would take another century for pirates to write that custom down as law. Aboard your ship, it's already unwritten law all the same. Landfall at La Goulette comes as something close to a religious experience after months at sea, solid ground underfoot that doesn't move, water that doesn't taste of the cask, a market bursting with fruit none of the Cornish or Kentish men aboard can name. Uthman Day's officials come aboard to take their agreed cut before a single item of cargo goes ashore for private sale, a transaction so routine to the local customs officers that they barely look up from their ledgers while doing it. The ceremony of it has its own strange formality. Uthman Day doesn't come to the quay himself. A man of his rank doesn't need to, but his officials do, moving through the unloaded cargo with the unhurried confidence of men who have done this dozens of times before, marking bolts of cloth and sacks of spice against a ledger while armed janissaries stand by less to intimidate your crew, who are by now well used to the arrangement, than to discourage any local merchant from trying to slip a purchase past the count. You watch a man who was, 18 months ago, robbing merchant ships off the coast of his own homeland now stand patiently, while a foreign government takes its cut of the proceeds, with the bureaucratic calm of a customs house, and you understand, maybe for the first time, that what your captain has built here isn't really an escape from law and order at all. It's a different law and order entirely, one with its own taxes, its own paperwork, its own quietly enforced rules, just conducted in a language none of you can read, under a flag none of you were born under. You watch Toby Rundle, missing 2 fingers, walk down the gangplank into a city he never imagined existing when he was a boy hauling nets off Fowey, and you understand, watching him, that neither of you is quite the person who signed aboard that grey English dock a year and a half ago. Toby, for his part, doesn't hesitate. He's already talking, before the 2 of you have gone 100 yards past the customs officials, about a room he's heard of near the harbour where a man can get a hot meal that isn't salt beef and biscuit, and about writing, or rather, paying someone who can write, since neither of you reads or writes beyond your own name, a letter home to Fowey with enough coin folded inside it to make the years away feel, if not forgiven, at least explained. He still hums that same 3-bar psalm tune under his breath sometimes, missing fingers and all, and you've come to understand it isn't really about the tune at all. It's about carrying one small unbroken piece of home into a life that has otherwise become almost unrecognisable from the one either of you set out from. A fisherman's tune, hummed off key by a man with 2 fewer fingers than he started with. Standing in a harbour neither of you could have found on a map 2 years ago, 600 miles and a whole lifetime removed from home. That, as much as any share of captured cargo, is what you've actually been fighting to keep this whole voyage. Not just your life, but some thread back to who you were before you signed your name to a recruiter's list on a grey dock and became, in the eyes of the only king you'd ever known, a criminal. What happens below decks, and in the back streets of Tunius over the months that follow, for the men who stay, and for the very different fate that waits for a captured sailor who ends up on the wrong side of a raid like the one you've just come through, is a different matter entirely, and it deserves its own telling. For now, know only that you have a choice waiting for you on that quay, the same choice every man on this ship will eventually have to take your share. Find passage home, and try to explain to a wife or a mother where the money came from, or stay, and become part of the very world your captain is building, brick by looted brick, 600 miles from anywhere you used to call home. Every man on that quay in Tunias owed his fortune, however unevenly it was divided, to a single afternoon of cannon fire that hadn't happened yet when Toby Rundle first walked ashore counting his fingers. It's time to go back to that afternoon properly, the 26th of April 1607, and the largest prize any English pirate had ever attempted to take. By the spring of 1607, Ward's fleet numbered 4 ships: the Gift, the Little John, the Ruby, and the Carminati, and his ambitions had grown to match. The plan was to cruise the Adriatic, hunting the rich Venetian trade that ran between the Italian mainland and the Ottoman ports of the eastern Mediterranean, but a violent storm scattered the fleet before it ever reached its hunting ground. Ward, aboard the Gift, found only the Ruby still with him once the weather cleared, the other 2 ships lost somewhere over the horizon. A lesser captain might have turned back to Tunis to regroup. Ward, with supplies running low and 2 ships instead of 4, turned east instead, toward the waters between Cyprus and the Turkish coast. Waters that would, within days, put him face to face with a ship roughly 4 times the combined size of everything he had left. The Reniera e Sodorina was, by the standards of her day, a genuine giant, a Venetian argosy of 14 or 1500 tons, returning from Aleppo laden with cotton, silk, indigo and salt. Cargo that Andrew Barker's later pamphlet would claim was worth £2 million at the least. Though the English government's own, more sober assessment put the figure closer to 500,000, still an almost unimaginable sum, and either way enough to make Venice's ambassadors furious for years afterward. Against her stood Ward's 2 ships, the Ruby at 400 tons and the Gift at a mere 200, together not even half her displacement. By any conventional naval logic, attacking her was close to suicidal. Ward's crew, according to the account that survives, elected to attack her anyway. What saved them was the same thing that makes the Sodorina worth remembering at all: wind. The great argosy, built for cargo capacity rather than manoeuvrability, could barely answer her helm in the light spring breeze, while Ward's smaller. Nimbler ships could circle her freely, staying just outside the arc of her heaviest guns, while pouring shot into her hull from angles she couldn't easily bring her own cannon to bear on. For 3 hours, the 2 sides traded fire in this uneven dance, the Sodorina's crew dragging bales of raw cotton up from the hold to stack along the rails as makeshift armour. Ward's gunners finding the range again and again, punching 5 separate holes clean through her sides, setting the exposed cotton smouldering in more than one place. It was, by any honest account, a desperate, chaotic fight, decided as much by geometry and luck as by courage on either side. Picture the scene from inside it, because the dry tally of hours and gun holes doesn't capture what 3 hours of this kind of fighting actually meant for the men living through it. The Sodorina's deck by the 2nd hour would have been a chaos of smoke thick enough to blur one end of the ship from the other. The reek of burnt powder mixing with the sweeter, more sickening smell of scorched cotton, catching a light below. Every time Ward's ships came about to bring fresh guns to bear, the Sodorina's own crew, merchant sailors, most of them, never trained for a sustained naval engagement, would have felt the whole enormous hull shudder under impacts they had no way to answer, watching 2 much smaller ships dance just out of range of their own heaviest guns like something out of a nightmare about being stung to. Death by insects too quick to swat. Fear in a fight like this doesn't arrive as a single dramatic moment. It arrives as 3 relentless hours of not knowing whether the next shot will find the powder store, and there is no dry historical footnote that fully accounts for what that does to 80 or 100 men trapped together on a burning deck with nowhere to go. Even Ward's own crews, crowded aboard ships a fraction of the Sodorina's size, would have spent those same 3 hours bracing for a broadside heavy enough to end the fight, and the engagement, in a single unlucky moment, their smaller hulls offering considerably less to absorb a direct hit than the giant they were circling. The moment that actually ended it, though, wasn't cannon fire at all. A single shot of chain, 2 iron balls linked by a length of chain, designed to shred rigging and anything caught in its path, tore across the Sodorina's deck and killed 2 of her crew outright, and in the panic and grief that followed, her own carpenter turned to the captain and told him, plainly, that the men would not fight much longer. Faced with a burning ship, a crew on the edge of open refusal, and no realistic prospect of victory, the Sodorina's captain gave the order to strike her colours. Ward took the largest prize of his career without another shot being fired after that, a fact his crew would remember, in the months that followed, rather differently than the pamphleteers back in London chose to. It's worth pausing on where these numbers actually come from, because the gap between them is itself part of the story. The £2 million figure comes almost entirely from Andrew Barker's pamphlet, the same Andrew Barker whose own ship had been seized by Ward's lieutenant William Graves, giving him every personal incentive in the world to make Ward's crimes sound as monstrous and enriching as possible to an English readership already hungry for pirate scandal. The English government's own, far more conservative estimate of roughly £500,000 came from officials with the opposite incentive. Downplaying the loss made England's failure to control its own pirates look somewhat less catastrophic on the European stage. Neither number, in other words, comes from a neutral source, and the true value of the Sodorina's cargo likely sits somewhere in the wide, uncomfortable gap between a furious victim's exaggeration and an embarrassed government's understatement. What both sides agreed on, tellingly, was that whatever the real figure, it was enough to nearly start a war, and that kind of agreement, across 2 sources with every reason to disagree, is usually the closest thing history gives you to solid ground. Whichever number you believe, the Sodorina's cargo remains, by a wide margin, the richest single prize any English pirate is documented to have taken in this entire era of Mediterranean piracy, and it alone would have been enough to secure Ward's place in the history books, even if every other chapter of his life had gone quietly and unremarkably from there, which, as you're about to see, it very much did not. News of the capture reached Venice and London within weeks, and the reaction tells you everything about what this single prize actually meant. The Venetian ambassador in London called Ward, in a phrase that would follow him for the rest of his life, the greatest scoundrel that had ever sailed from England. A remarkable statement from a diplomat representing a maritime republic that had, itself, built much of its wealth on centuries of naval aggression. Venice's government, for its part, came close to declaring outright war on England over the loss. Furious that a nation nominally at peace with the Republic was harbouring, however unofficially, the pirate who had just gutted one of its richest merchant vessels. English officials in Venice scrambled to distance the crown from Ward entirely, assuring the Republic's council that any pirate captain foolish enough to sail into Venetian waters again would meet, in the diplomatic language of the day, a very warm reception indeed. A threat everyone understood to mean capture and execution, not hospitality. Back in Tunis, where Ward brought his prize in June of 1607, for a triumphal entry that turned the entire waterfront out to watch, the Sodorina became something closer to a construction project than a captured ship. Over the summer and autumn, Ward's men cut at least 20 new gun ports into her already massive hull, arming her with 60 bronze cannon until she was no longer simply the richest ship Ward had ever taken, but the single most powerful warship any English pirate had ever commanded. Contemporary accounts describe Ward in these months as almost drunk on his own success. One hostile source records him declaring, with no apparent embarrassment, that he now considered himself the sole and only commander of the seas. It is exactly the kind of line a pamphleteer eager to paint Ward as a cautionary tale of pride would be tempted to invent or exaggerate, and it should be read with that caution in mind. But even allowing for exaggeration, the underlying fact isn't in dispute. By the end of 1607, John Ward, fisherman's son, deserter, thief of a 25-ton bark, commanded the most formidable private warship in the Mediterranean. The scale of that refit deserves its own moment of wonder, separate from everything it would later cost. Cutting 20 new gun ports into a ship's hull is not a weekend's carpentry. It means shipwrights and caulkers working through an entire Tunisian summer and autumn, reinforcing frames never designed to bear the recoil of heavy bronze cannon, hauling 60 guns aboard one at a time, restowing ballast to keep a top-heavy, overarmed hull from rolling herself under in the first stiff wind. It was, by the standards of any Mediterranean shipyard in 1607, an enormous undertaking, and the fact that a fisherman's son with no formal training in naval architecture could commission it, pay for it, and see it completed inside a single season tells you something about both the size of his fortune and the confidence, verging on recklessness, that fortune had bought him. 60 bronze cannon was not a merchant's armament. It was closer to what a small kingdom's flagship might carry, and for one golden season in 1607, the most powerful warship in the Mediterranean flew under the command of a man who, 4 years earlier, had been deserting his post aboard an English patrol ship with 30 other unpaid, unhappy sailors. He sailed her out again that December at the head of a small fleet, financed partly by his own growing fortune and partly by Uthman Dey and other wealthy backers eager for a share in whatever came next. What came next was not another triumph. Sometime that winter, word reached Ward that the Soderina, hastily converted from a merchant argosy into a warship, her aging timbers never designed to carry 60 guns worth of additional weight and recoil, had begun, quietly and then not so quietly, to rot and take on water. This is the part of the story the pamphlets back in London were considerably less eager to print, because it makes Ward's next decision look considerably less like piracy and considerably more like plain self-preservation at someone else's expense. With several of his officers, Ward abandoned the sinking Soderina, transferring himself and his closest men to one of the French prizes his fleet had captured, and left the rest of her crew, roughly 400 men in total, by the surviving count, some 250 of them Muslim sailors serving under the Corsair fleet, and around 150 of them English, to go down with her off the coast of Greece. There is a bitter irony worth naming here, one that connects directly back to the ship you spent the last chapter aboard. When Toby Rundle crushed 2 fingers careening his own vessel, his crewmates quietly set aside an extra share for him, without being asked, because that was the unwritten custom binding a crew together in a trade with no law but its own. The 400 men aboard the sinking Soderina got no such consideration. Their captain wasn't there to divide anything in their favour. He had already left, and the custom that made men like Toby's crew trust each other with their lives only ever worked when the man at the top honoured it too. Ward's desertion of the Soderina isn't just a tactical retreat recorded in a ledger of losses. It's the exact moment the informal code holding his whole operation together was tested against Ward's own survival instinct, and lost. Remember too that roughly 150 of the men who went down with her were English, renegades and adventurers who had made the same calculation Toby Rundle made on that grey West Country dock, chasing better wages than an honest trade could offer. Somewhere in England that winter, 150 households that had been quietly, uneasily living off money sent home from Tunias would have gone on waiting for a letter, or a purse, or a husband's eventual return, none of it ever coming. With no official notice, no naval record, nothing but the slow, creeping realization that comes when a correspondence simply stops. Piracy, when it's romanticized, tends to erase this part almost entirely, the ordinary domestic grief that trails an unglamorous shipwreck exactly the way it trails any other death at sea, whether the ship flew an honest flag or not. Sit with that number for a moment, because it's easy, in a story this loaded with cannon fire and captured fortunes, to let 400 drowned men become an abstraction. They weren't. They were gunners and topmen and powder boys, Muslim sailors who had signed on under Uthman Dey's arrangement expecting a captain's protection, and English renegades who had crossed an entire sea and an entire religion's worth of risk to serve under a man who, when the ship he'd built began to sink, chose his own survival over theirs, without, as far as the record shows, a second thought. Ironically, the ships Ward escaped to were themselves lost within weeks, captured by Venice, which had never stopped hunting for exactly this kind of retribution, so that the campaign that was supposed to cement Ward's reputation as the undisputed master of the sea instead cost him nearly his entire fleet and several hundred men who had trusted him with their lives. In March of 1608, wreckage was spotted off the Greek coast, and for a brief strange window, rumour spread through the ports of the Mediterranean that the wreck was the Soderina herself and that Ward had gone down with her. It's worth pausing on how quickly the world was willing to believe that story, a testament, in its own dark way, to how thoroughly Ward's name had already come to stand for a specific kind of overreach that everyone half expected to end badly. The rumour turned out to be premature. Ward was very much alive, but the disaster left him in a genuinely precarious position for the first time since he'd arrived in Tunis. Many among the Muslim sailors and officials who had backed his fleet were furious over his desertion of the Soderina's crew. His fortune had taken a real hit, and Venice's fury showed no sign of cooling. Facing this collapse in his standing, Ward did something that reveals just how thin the line between pirate and diplomat had become in his mind. He petitioned King James I of England for a royal pardon, an offer, in essence, to come home, lay down his arms, and rejoin the kingdom he'd deserted 5 years earlier. It is worth imagining, for a moment, what that letter must have cost a man like Ward to write, an admission, however carefully worded, that the empire he'd built at Uthman Dey's side was not, in the end, secure enough to stand on its own. James considered it, and then, under pressure from Venice, which made clear that any pardon for the man who had gutted the Soderina would be read as England openly rewarding an act of war against the Republic, James refused. Ward, with nowhere else to turn, sailed reluctantly back to Tunis, and Uthman Dey, to his considerable credit, kept the bargain he had struck years earlier, and granted Ward protection despite the disaster and the anger it had caused. Why Uthman Dey chose forgiveness over abandoning Ward entirely is worth a moment's thought, because it wasn't sentiment either. Whatever anger the desertion had stirred up among Tunis's Muslim sailors and their families, Ward remained, disaster and all, one of the most experienced Atlantic-style ship captains anywhere on the Barbary coast. A man who had personally delivered Uthman Dey more captured wealth in 2 years than most corsair captains managed in 10. Rulers who depend on plunder for their treasury tend to be practical about which assets they can afford to discard, and Ward, even diminished, was still an asset worth keeping. It is one of the quieter, less flattering truths of this whole story. The loyalty that saved Ward's life in his darkest hour wasn't loyalty at all, in any sense you or I might recognise the word. It was simply good accounting. The fisherman's son who had once considered himself sole commander of the seas now owed his continued survival entirely to the goodwill of a foreign ruler, after his own king had just told him, in the clearest possible terms, that there was no way home left at all. There's a bit of dark comedy buried in James's dilemma too. If you're willing to look for it, an English king embarrassed by an English pirate, forced to publicly disown a man who had only months earlier offered to come home and be forgiven. It's the diplomatic equivalent of a parent pretending not to recognise an unruly child in a crowded market, except the child in question commanded 60 bronze cannon and had just come within a hair of triggering a war between 2 of Europe's naval powers. James could not afford to be seen rewarding that kind of behaviour. However much quiet advantage England's merchants might privately have taken from the chaos Ward caused Venetian shipping. Diplomacy, in this instance, mattered more to the crown than one prodigal pirate's rehabilitation, and Ward paid the price for a calculation made almost entirely without him in the room. That refusal is the hinge this entire story turns on, and it deserves to be named plainly. Had James found a way to grant that pardon, the rest of Ward's life, the conversion, the legend, the axe, the birds, everything still to come, might never have happened at all. Instead, a diplomatic calculation made in London, weighing Venetian goodwill against one pirate's future, closed the door behind him for good. Ward was going to have to become something else entirely now, not an Englishman abroad, not a privateer waiting out a temporary disgrace, but something with no ready word yet in either language, because the Englishman he had been no longer had anywhere left in England to return to. The fortune, the ship, the reluctant reprieve from Uthman Day. All of it looked very different depending on which side of Ward's guns you happened to be standing on. For every share of plunder that reached a common sailor's palm, there was a captured crew somewhere on the other end of that same transaction, and their story has been left out of almost every version of this tale that's ever been told. It's time to fix that. You wake to the smell of tar smoke and unfamiliar spice, and for a confused half-second, still half asleep, you think you're aboard your own ship, the Charity, 3 weeks out of Livorno with a hold full of Genoese cloth. Then the rope around your wrists reminds you otherwise. 4 days ago, this wasn't your life. 4 days ago, you were an ordinary merchant sailor watching a sail grow larger on the horizon with the same mild professional interest you'd give any approaching ship, right up until the moment it became clear she was running an intercept course, low and fast, with more guns run out than any honest trader would ever need to carry. Your captain held his nerve longer than you expected, crowding on sail, cutting for the nearest stretch of open water, but the Charity was built for cargo capacity, not speed, and the ship chasing her was built for exactly this. When the range closed and the first warning shot cracked across your bow, your captain made the only sane calculation available to him. Dead crew and a sunk ship serve no one, least of all a family waiting for him back in Genoa. He struck the colours. You told yourself in that first hour that surrender meant safety. Congratulations, it meant something considerably more complicated than that. None of this is guesswork stitched together for effect. Historians reconstruct exactly this kind of captivity from a substantial paper trail, merchant house ledgers recording ransom negotiations line by line, the surviving account books of the Trinitarian and Mercedarian redemptionist orders, consular correspondence between European trading posts and their governments back home, and a smaller but invaluable set of captivity narratives written by former captives themselves once they'd made it home, and in a few cases learned to write well enough to set the whole ordeal down on paper. The broad shape of what happens to you in this chapter, the sorting by trade and health, the price ranges, the years-long waits, the conversions born of exhaustion rather than conviction, is drawn from that documented pattern, even where the specific people you've met along the way, Bartolomeo and Enzo and Peter Code among them, stand in for the thousands of real individuals whose full names and fates were never recorded at all. Estimates drawn from exactly this kind of surviving paperwork suggest that corsairs operating out of the Barbary ports took something on the order of 1 million captives across the centuries this trade ran, a scale that turns your own 5 months of waiting into a single, small thread inside an enormous, largely anonymous tapestry of human loss and, occasionally, redemption. The corsairs who took your ship worked with a brisk, almost bureaucratic efficiency that surprised you more than the violence would have. Nobody was killed in the taking of the Charity. Dead captives, you'll come to understand, are worth nothing at all, while living ones are worth a great deal, and a crew with any experience knows exactly which outcome serves them better. What they did do, within the first hour, was strip the ship of everything portable and strip you, personally, of everything you owned beyond the clothes on your back, not out of casual cruelty, you'll realise later, but because a captive's possessions are simply more cargo, tallied alongside the cloth and the coin in the same ledger that will later record your own eventual price. The voyage to Tunis passes in a blur of seasickness, thirst, and a specific grinding uncertainty that turns out to be worse than any single moment of violence. Nobody will tell you what happens next. You are fed. Sparingly, but you are fed, which you'll later learn is itself a small mercy, since a captive who arrives at market half-starved fetches a lower price than one who arrives in reasonable health. You are, in other words, being maintained the way a farmer maintains livestock bound for a good sale. And understanding that fact does something to a person that the actual physical hardship, bad as it is, somehow doesn't quite manage on its own. La Goulette, when you finally see it, is nothing like the port you imagined when your captain first mentioned Barbary corsairs in the same breath as ghost stories meant to frighten new hands. It's a real city, ringed with fortifications, its harbour busy with ordinary commercial traffic that has nothing to do with piracy at all. Fishing boats, merchant vessels flying half a dozen different flags. A rhythm of daily life that continues, indifferent, around the narrow business of men like you being marched ashore in a chained line. Somewhere beyond the customs house, you'll later learn, sits the same quay where an English pirate captain's own crews unload their captured cargo under Othman Day's watchful ledger keepers. The very trade that put you in this line in the first place operating not 2 streets away from where you're now being processed as its product. You expected a den of monsters. What you find is a functioning city that simply happens to include a slave market as one of its ordinary economic institutions, no more remarkable to the locals going about their mourning than a fish market would be back home. The market itself is the detail that will stay with you longest if you ever make it home to tell anyone about it. You are examined the way a horse trader examines a horse, teeth checked, hands turned over and inspected for calluses that might indicate a useful trade, muscle assessed with an appraising eye that has clearly done this thousands of times before. It is degrading in a way that violence, strangely, isn't. Violence at least treats you as a threat worth respecting. This treats you as a commodity, a category of object with a market price, and you understand, standing in that line, that whatever happens to you next will be decided entirely by that price, and by who is willing to pay it. Not every captive standing in that line is bound for the same fate, and watching the sorting process happen in real time teaches you more about this economy than any explanation could. The strongest, healthiest-looking men among you are drawing particular interest from a separate group of buyers entirely, agents purchasing on behalf of the galley fleets, where oarsmen are worked, chained to their benches, in conditions so punishing that a captive's working life there is measured, brutally, in a handful of years rather than decades. Men with a visible trade, a blacksmith's forearms, a carpenter's calloused palms, the particular wear pattern on a ropemaker's hands, draw a different class of buyer altogether. Household and workshop owners looking for skilled labour they can put to use for far longer than a galley bench would ever allow. You watch this triage happen with the cold efficiency of men who have done it 1,000 times, and you understand with a kind of sick clarity that your own future is currently being decided by nothing more than what your hands happen to look like. A wealthy Tunisian merchant, weighing the hands of the man next to you in line, a Genoese sailor named Bartolomeo, who's been a captive twice before in his life and speaks enough broken Arabic by now to negotiate his own price with a bleak, practised calm that unsettles you more than his fear would have, buys him outright as household labour, and Bartolomeo is gone within the hour. Walked off toward a life you have no way of picturing. Before he goes, he presses something into your hand without a word, a small, smooth stone he'd apparently been carrying since his first captivity, worn nearly round by years in his pocket, and you understand, watching him disappear into the crowd, that it was the only thing he had left to give anyone, and he chose to give it to a stranger he'd known for 4 days rather than keep it for himself. You yourself are held back for a different fate. A message has already gone ahead to a Christian merchant house in the city, the kind of intermediary that exists specifically to arrange ransoms, and someone has decided you look like a man whose family, back in whatever port sent you to sea, might have the means to pay for your return. Ransom is its own strange economy, running parallel to the outright sale of captives into labour, and if you're going to survive the next months with your sanity intact, you need to understand how it works fast. A price gets set, not arbitrarily, but based on your apparent trade, your apparent family's means, and a merchant's educated guess at what a European family might scrape together rather than lose a son or husband forever. Letters go out through a network of merchants, consuls, and, for those without wealthy families of their own, religious orders back in Catholic Europe. The Trinitarians and the Mercedarians, whose entire mission for centuries has been raising funds specifically to buy Christian captives out of Barbary bondage. Some men wait months for word. Some wait years. Some, their families unable or unwilling to pay, wait for a ransom that never comes at all, and either die in captivity or, eventually, convert and stay. The same choice that faced every English renegade you've heard whispered about since you first heard the word corsair. The economics of your own price, once you finally learn what it was, turn out to be almost clinically precise, the same way any commodity market runs once you're inside it, rather than imagining it from outside. An ordinary seaman like yourself, without rank or trade to raise your value, typically fetched somewhere in the range of 100 to 200 pieces of eight on the Barbary ransom market in these years, a sum that could take a modest family the better part of a year's income to raise, which is exactly why so many captives waited so long. A ship's captain or a merchant of known means could be priced several times higher, on the theory, cynical but not unreasonable, that his family or his trading house would find a way to pay almost anything to get him back. Slaves purchased outright for labour, by contrast, were valued the way any working asset is valued, against the years of service a buyer could reasonably expect to extract, which is precisely why the healthiest, youngest men in your intake line drew the highest bids from household and workshop buyers, and precisely why the weakest and oldest among you were the ones nobody seemed eager to claim at all, ransom or no ransom. By your third month in the Bagno, the fortified compound where captives awaiting ransom or resale are held, more prison than dungeon, crowded with men from a dozen different nations all waiting on the same uncertain arithmetic, you've learned the specific rhythm of hope and disappointment that defines this kind of waiting. A ship arrives from Genoa or Marseille or Livorno, and for a day the whole compound buzzes with the possibility that it carries ransom money, someone's letter, someone's deliverance. Most days it doesn't. You watch men around you cycle through this exact hope and exact disappointment on a schedule as regular as the tides, and you understand that whatever else this place is, it is also an engine for slowly, methodically grinding down a person's capacity to keep hoping at all. The Bagno itself has a rhythm you learn fast, because your body has no choice but to learn it. Days begin before full light, with a distribution of bread that never quite fills the ache in your stomach, and never quite starves you either, a deliberate calibration you come to suspect, aimed at keeping a captive workforce functional rather than either comfortable or dying. Men without a buyer's specific task assigned to them for the day are put to labour around the compound itself, hauling water, repairing walls, work that exists as much to keep hundreds of idle, frightened men too tired to plot escape as it does to accomplish anything useful. You share a sleeping space with 11 other men from 4 different nations, and within weeks you've picked up enough scattered words of Italian, French and Dutch to trade small kindnesses, a shared blanket on a cold night. A warning passed along about a particularly cruel overseer with men whose language you couldn't speak a single sentence of the day you arrived. It is, in its own strange way, its own kind of community, forged from nothing but shared misfortune and the same uncertain arithmetic hanging over every man in the room, from the youngest powder boy to the oldest galley hand. There is a particular kind of captive in the Bagno with you worth naming honestly, because his path forward looks nothing like Bartolomeo's, and nothing like the ransom you're still waiting on. A young Devon sailor named Peter Code, captured 2 years before you, who has watched every letter he sent home go unanswered and watched 2 ransom collections fall through at the last moment over. Disputes about price. Peter has started in the last few weeks asking quiet questions about conversion, not out of any sudden religious conviction, he tells you plainly one night, but because a renegade in Tunis can own property, can marry, can build something resembling an actual life, while a Christian captive without ransom money can only wait, indefinitely, for a rescue that may simply never arrive. You don't judge him for it, not really, though you notice you also don't tell him you understand. The line between piracy and desperation, you're starting to realise, runs through the captives just as surely as it runs through the men who captured them. Not every story to come out of the Bagno is one of grinding loss, and it would be dishonest to tell this the same way the pamphlets do, as an unbroken parade of misery with no light in it anywhere. There's an older captive in your section, a Genoese barrel maker named Enzo, who's been waiting on ransom for going on 3 years, who's taken it upon himself to teach any man who'll sit still long enough the rudiments of coopering how to read the grain of a stave. How to true a barrel head, a trade that has, twice since you arrived, meant the difference between a captive being sold into brutal galley labour and being kept instead as skilled household or workshop help. Safer work, with a real chance of surviving long enough to be ransomed at all. Enzo asks nothing for the lessons beyond company while he works. And you understand, watching him patiently correct some new arrival's grip on a draw knife for the 10th time, that he has found, inside the worst circumstance of his life, some way to still be useful to someone, and that this, more than any letter from home, more than any prayer, is what has kept him sane through 3 years of waiting. He tells you once, almost offhand, that he's outlasted 4 different overseers in his time here, simply by making himself too useful to sell off cheaply or work to death, a small, stubborn survival strategy built entirely out of patience and a trade he happened to already know. Hope, in a place like this, rarely arrives as good news. More often it looks exactly like Enzo, an ordinary man deciding, day after day, that teaching a stranger something useful still matters, even here, even now. Word finally comes for you in your 5th month, not through any grand rescue, but through the unglamorous machinery of commerce. A Trinitarian agent, travelling with a fund raised across a dozen parish collections back in Genoa, has negotiated your price down through weeks of haggling that you were never present for and never had any say in. You are walked out of the Bagno on an ordinary Tuesday, handed over like a piece of returned property, with no ceremony beyond a receipt exchanged between 2 merchants who will never meet you again. You look for Bartolomeo on your way out, hoping for some kind of goodbye, and don't find him. He's already been absorbed somewhere into the ordinary daily life of the city. One more captive who simply disappeared into someone else's household, his fate now as unknown to you as yours was, 5 months ago, to everyone back home. Peter Code, you learn later, does convert. Within the year, one more Englishman added to the small growing community of renegades that men like John Ward's own crew have been building in Tunis since before you ever set sail on the Charity. Whether that counts as tragedy or survival depends, you suspect, entirely on who's telling the story. The same question, really, that hangs over every single person you met in that market, on both sides of the transaction, for the whole of your captivity. The passage home is its own strange anticlimax. You expect, somehow, that crossing back into Christian waters will feel like an ending, a door closing cleanly behind you on everything the last 5 months contained. It doesn't. You find yourself, weeks later, standing in a Genoese street that looks exactly as it did before you ever set sail on the Charity, and discover that you are the one who has changed too much to simply slot back into the life waiting there. You flinch at the sound of a market crier's voice pitched a certain way, because it recalls, for half a second, the auctioneer's cadence at the slave market before your mind catches up and corrects itself. You find yourself, unbidden, calculating the value of strangers' hands the way the buyers on that quay once calculated yours, and hate yourself a little for the habit, even as you can't quite stop it. Nobody back home wants to hear the details. Not really. They want the short version. The one where you were captured and then, thank God, ransomed, with the 5 months in between compressed into a single grateful sentence. You learn, faster than you expected, to give them that short version, and to keep the rest, Bartolomeo's face as he was led away, Peter Code's quiet questions about conversion, Enzo's patient hands correcting a stranger's grip on a draw knife, folded somewhere private, for the nights when sleep doesn't come easily and the whole of it plays back anyway, uninvited, the way it still will, on and off, for the rest of your life. Not every renegade captain on the Barbary coast made the same choice Ward did once fortune turned against him. To understand what staying really cost, and what it might have looked like to choose differently, we need to meet the one man in this story who tried. On the 17th of November, 1609, 4 heavily armed warships sailed into the harbour at Marseille, flying no flag that made immediate sense to the crowd gathering on the quay to watch them come in. At their head stood a Dutchman named Seaman Danziger, known across the Mediterranean by then as Simon the Dancer, or in the Turkish styling he'd earned in Algiers, Simon Reis. And he was coming home. After years as one of the two most feared Corsair commanders on the entire Barbary coast, to a pardon he had personally negotiated with the King of France himself. Word of a returning renegade admiral had clearly travelled ahead of the ships themselves, spreading through the taverns and merchant houses of the port in the days leading up to his arrival, so that by the time his sails actually cleared the harbour mouth, half the city had already turned out simply to see whether the rumour was true. This is the story of the pirate who did exactly what John Ward asked King James for and was refused. He went home. What happened to him afterward is going to complicate, considerably, any tidy lesson you might be tempted to draw from that difference. Picture the scene properly, because it's worth sitting in for a moment before we unpack how it got there. 4 warships, flying colours that belonged to no navy the watching crowd on Marseille's quay could immediately place, gliding into a harbour most of the onlookers assumed they'd never see except as raiders. Word had clearly travelled ahead of the ships themselves, because the crowd that gathered wasn't panicked. It was curious, even celebratory, the way a crowd gathers for a spectacle rather than a threat. At the rail of the lead ship stood a man most of Christian Europe had spent the better part of a decade being warned about, dressed, by every surviving description, in a manner that split the difference between Dutch merchant and Ottoman admiral. A study in exactly the kind of contradiction his whole career had been built on. He was not arriving as a captive. He was not arriving under guard. He was arriving as a negotiated equal, and the crowd on that quay understood, watching him come ashore, that they were witnessing something almost nobody in their lifetime had seen before. A Corsair coming home by choice, with a king's pardon already signed and waiting. Danziger's early life mirrors Ward's closely enough that the two men's later alliance makes a strange kind of sense, and it's a resemblance worth naming plainly before going any further into what eventually pulled their two stories apart. Born around 1579 in Dordrecht, in the Dutch Republic, he came up through exactly the kind of maritime world that produced men like Ward on the other side of the Channel, a young Protestant nation locked in a decades-long war against Catholic Spain, its ports thick with privateers who blurred, by economic necessity, the line between state-sanctioned raiding and outright piracy. Where Ward drifted south from an English naval desertion, Danziger drifted south from Dutch privateering against Spanish shipping, and by the early 1600s he had found his way, as Ward would a few years later, to a Barbary port willing to give a skilled European captain a foreign flag and a share of the take. His base was Algiers rather than Ward's Tunis, and the two cities. Rival statelets under the same loose Ottoman umbrella occasionally cooperated and occasionally competed for the same shipping lanes and the same Corsair captains. But Danziger and Ward, by most contemporary accounts, became genuine allies, their combined squadrons representing, together, a naval power that Christian Europe's own admiralties had real reason to fear, allies who, according to at least one surviving account, sailed in company together on a joint venture along the coast before their careers diverged, hunting under two different flags of convenience but the same essential business. Ward flying whatever colours he'd captured most recently, Danziger doing the same, two renegade captains who trusted each other's seamanship more than they trusted either government that had once claimed their loyalty. Danziger earned a nickname from his own crews worth noting here too, Daddy Reyes, Captain Devil, a title bestowed less out of fear of cruelty, by most accounts, than out of sheer awe at his seamanship and his willingness to sail further from safe harbour than any Corsair captain before him. He is also credited, by some maritime historians, with helping introduce the round-hulled single-rudder cargo ship, a northern European design, better suited to the rough Atlantic swells he was determined to push his fleet into, to Mediterranean Corsair fleets that had spent centuries relying on oar-powered galleys instead. A small but genuine technical legacy that outlived every rumour about how he died. It's a detail worth holding on to for what comes later in this chapter. Whatever cooperation existed between these two men ran deep enough, by every account, that when word eventually reached Ward of Danziger's death, whatever its true cause, it would have reached him not as news about a rival, but as news about the closest thing to appear the isolated foreign-flagged world of the renegade corsair ever really allowed a man like him to have. Danziger's success in these years actually outpaced Ward's by some measures. Algiers and Tunis, it's worth understanding, were not simply two interchangeable corsair ports running the identical arrangement Ward had struck with Uthman Dey. Both cities operated under the same loose Ottoman umbrella. Both were governed in practice by local military strongmen rather than any distant sultan's direct command. And both had discovered, independently, that welcoming skilled European renegade captains was good business. But they were also rivals, jockeying for the same prize ships, the same skilled crews, and the same reputation as the coast's most formidable corsair power. That rivalry makes the Ward-Danziger alliance more remarkable, not less. Two captains, based in competing cities, chose cooperation over competition often enough that European observers came to speak of their combined squadrons in the same breath, comparing them, as one Tunisian chronicler of the period did, to the legendary Barbarossa brothers who had dominated Mediterranean corsair warfare the century before. Both Ward and Danziger appear, prominently and by name, in a Tunisian history written not long after their deaths, a rare instance of the corsair world's own chroniclers, rather than only its European victims, recording these men's careers for posterity. A reminder that the story you're hearing tonight has always looked different depending on which side of the Mediterranean was doing the telling. Danziger's success in these years actually outpaced Ward's by some measures. Historical accounts credit him with capturing more than 40 ships in a single 2-year stretch after formally converting and taking Ottoman service, an extraordinary rate of predation that made him, alongside Ward, one of the two names European merchants dreaded most in any conversation about the Mediterranean trade routes. He built himself, like Ward, an opulent palace in his adopted city, and unlike Ward, he pushed his operations further than almost any corsair captain before him had dared, leading Algiers' fleet out through the Strait of Gibraltar and into the open Atlantic, reportedly raiding as far north as Iceland in the years that followed, a feat of blue water sailing that had simply never been attempted by a Barbary squadron before him. But here's the detail that separates Danziger from Ward at the level of the heart, not just the Ursum. He had left a wife and children behind in Marseille, and unlike Ward, who kept his English family connection alive only through money sent quietly across a sea he never crossed again, Danziger never stopped wanting to see his in person. In 1609, in the middle of taking a Spanish galleon off the coast of Valencia, he found his opening. Jesuit priests aboard the captured ship became his unlikely intermediaries, carrying a message back toward the French court. Danziger wanted exoneration, wanted his crimes forgiven, wanted to come home. Henri IV, weighing the diplomatic and military value of removing one of Algiers' most capable commanders from the board entirely, agreed to the terms, and a pardon was drawn up and waiting by the time Danziger's 4 warships came into view of Marseille's harbour that November. The homecoming itself was staged with real theatre. Welcomed personally by the Duke of Guise, in a reception meant, on both sides, to send an unmistakable political signal to the rest of Europe, Danziger presented his hosts with what one contemporary account describes, with a certain grim humour, as a present of some Turks, captured Muslim sailors from his own fleet, men who days or weeks earlier had been shipmates under his command, handed over now to be sent immediately to the French galleys as slaves. It was a calculated gesture, and a chilling one. Nothing proved a renegade's loyalty had genuinely completely switched sides, quite like sacrificing the very men who had trusted him as their commander. He added to it a substantial quantity of Spanish gold, plundered, presumably, from the very galleon whose capture had given him his opening to negotiate in the first place, laid out before the Duke as tangible proof that his years among the corsairs had made him rich enough to be worth welcoming home. Whatever else you make of Danziger's choices, there is something almost unbearably human in the image of a man who has spent years building a corsair's fortune specifically so he could buy his way back into his own family's arms, and something considerably darker in the fact that the price of admission was handing over men who days before had been serving under his own command. That gift, meant to secure Danziger's welcome, ended up detonating far beyond his own homecoming. Algiers authorities, furious at the loss of 2 advanced bronze cannon Danziger had also made off with, equipment lent to him by the Pasha of Algiers himself and never returned, declared war on France over the whole affair. A conflict that historians now call the Franco-Algerian War, which dragged on intermittently for nearly 2 decades, from 1609 until 1628, costing French merchant shipping catastrophic losses before the 2 sides finally settled and France agreed, as part of the peace, to return the 2 guns that had started it all. One homesick pirates reunion with his family had, without his particularly intending it, set off a naval conflict that would outlive his own return by nearly 20 years. Reunited with his wife and children after years apart, Danziger settled into Marseille for roughly a year, a homecoming that, on its face, offers exactly the ending Ward never got to have. Try to imagine what that year must have actually felt like from the inside, because it's the part of Danziger's story the naval histories have the least interest in, and the part that probably mattered most to him. A man who has spent the better part of a decade being feared across an entire sea, whose name alone could make a merchant captain strike his colours without a shot fired. Spending an ordinary Marseille afternoon watching children who barely remembered him grow another year older, sleeping in a bed that didn't pitch with the swell, answering to a wife who had spent those same years not knowing, from one season to the next, whether he was alive. Whatever guilt he carried over the men he'd handed to the galleys to buy that year, it's hard not to hope, at least a little, that it was worth it to him, 1 full year at minimum of being simply a husband and a father, rather than an admiral 3 governments wanted dead. And then French authorities, eager to make use of the one man alive who knew Algiers' corsair fleet from the inside, asked him to lead an expedition back against his former allies. Whatever mixture of loyalty, debt, restlessness, or simple inability to resist one more voyage moved him. Danziger agreed, and by the end of 1610 he was back at sea, back in the waters he'd spent a decade learning better than almost any man alive, waters that this time he would not sail out of again. What actually happened to Simon Danziger after that final departure is one of the genuinely disputed corners of this whole story, and it deserves to be told as the disputed thing it is, rather than dressed up as settled fact. Some sources place his death around 1611, killed or captured during that very expedition against Algiers. Other accounts push the date as late as 1615, with fewer specifics about the circumstances. And then there is a third version, traceable back to the Scottish traveller William Lithgow, the same eyewitness whose account of meeting John Ward in Tunis we're going to spend real time with shortly, which claims that Danziger was lured ashore under some pretext by an old ally turned enemy and quietly beheaded by Janissary soldiers once he'd stepped off his own ship and into a trap. And here is the detail that, if true, would turn this entire chapter's contrast between Ward and Danziger into something far darker. The man Lithgow's account names as the one who arranged the ambush is Yusuf, the Islamic name John Ward had taken for himself. We have to be honest about how thin this claim actually is. It rests on second-hand travellers' report rather than any court record, trial deposition, or eyewitness testimony from someone who was actually present. And Lithgow himself, for all his genuine value as a source who did personally meet Ward in Tunis, was also a writer with a documented taste for the dramatic, prone to folding rumour and legend into his travelogues with the same confident tone he used for things he'd witnessed firsthand. His book recounts encounters with murderers who spared his life out of sudden pity, corpses looted for their jewellery within hours of a duel, entire cities described in tones that shift, page to page, between careful observation and theatrical flourish. The work, in short, of a man who understood that a good story sold better than a cautious one, which should colour how much weight any single uncorroborated claim in his pages deserves to carry. It's entirely possible the betrayal story is exactly the kind of piece of gossip that would circulate about any sudden, unexplained death of a famous corsair, a satisfying poetic rumour rather than a documented fact, the 17th century equivalent of a tabloid headline dressed up as travel writing. But it's also true that Ward and Danziger's alliance, close as it was, existed entirely within a world where loyalty was transactional and survival came first, a lesson Ward himself had already demonstrated in the most brutal terms possible, when he abandoned 400 men to the sinking Reniere Sodorina rather than go down defending them. Whether Ward actually had a hand in his old ally's death or not, the fact that so many people who knew both men found the story plausible enough to repeat tells you something true about the world these two men had built together, even if it can't tell you, with any certainty, what actually happened on whatever quay Danziger stepped onto for the last time. Whatever the true cause, the practical result was the same either way. The one man in this story who tried hardest and paid the steepest price to buy his way back into an ordinary life never got to grow old in it. There's one more piece of this story worth setting down before drawing any conclusion from it, because it complicates the tidy renegade who chose loyalty reading of Danziger's return just as much as it complicates any simple villain's portrait of Ward. Danziger's decision to lead a French expedition back against his former allies wasn't merely opportunism dressed up as patriotism. French records suggest the crown pressed him hard for exactly this service, treating his intimate knowledge of Algiers' defences and fleet dispositions as too valuable an asset to leave unused once they had him back on friendly soil. A pardoned man, in other words, doesn't always get to simply retire from the world that shaped him. Sometimes the very knowledge that made him dangerous is the thing his new patrons value most. And sometimes that value comes with an unspoken expectation attached, one considerably harder to refuse than an ordinary request between friends. What the comparison leaves you with, certainty aside, is this. Two men who started from nearly identical circumstances, built nearly identical fortunes through nearly identical violence, and then, when circumstance finally offered each of them a door-marked home, chose in opposite directions. Ward asked for a pardon once, was refused, and never asked again, settling instead into permanent exile and eventually a fuller transformation than Danziger ever attempted. Danziger asked, was granted his pardon, went home, embraced his family, and then, whether from restlessness, debt or duty, sailed back into the exact world that pardon was supposed to have freed him from, and never came home again. Neither choice, in the end, brought either man the safety he was chasing. It brought Ward a strange, uneasy permanence in a foreign land that never fully trusted him. It brought Danziger, at best, one good year with his family before the sea and its debts called him back and swallowed him whole. There's a version of this story that wants to draw a clean moral from it, stay and prosper, or go home and perish, or the reverse, or some tidy lesson about the wages of piracy either way, and the honest answer is that the records simply won't support one. Ward, the man who never went home, lived on for another decade plus after Danziger's disappearance, growing old in relative comfort in the city he'd chosen, his fortune and his standing with Uthman Dey both, by every surviving account, still intact. Danziger, the man who did everything right by the standards of a homesick sailor, negotiated in good faith, delivered on his promises, embraced his family, served his new sovereign loyally, vanished from the record within 2 years of the reunion that was supposed to be his happy ending. Two men, two opposite choices, and neither outcome rewarding the choice that looked, on paper, like the more honourable one. History, it turns out, keeps its own accounts, and they rarely balance the way a good story would prefer. If there's a lesson buried in the contrast at all, it might simply be this. In a world built on the shifting, transactional loyalties of renegade captains, foreign rulers and kings weighing diplomacy against mercy, there was never any door, pardon, palace or otherwise, that actually led somewhere safe. There was only ever the next voyage, and the increasingly narrow odds of surviving it. Whatever happened to Danziger in the end, Ward's own choice, to stay, to convert, to build a permanent life in the city that had sheltered him when his own king wouldn't, is where this story has to go next. It's time to see what that chosen life actually looked like from the inside on an ordinary day years after the guns of the sod arena had gone quiet. The call to prayer reaches you before anything else does, threading up through a window that doesn't quite fit its frame, and for a moment, still half asleep, you let the sound wash over you the way you once let church bells do, back when church bells were a thing that happened in your life instead of a memory. Outside, the city is already stirring in the particular way port cities always do before full light, a fisherman's cart creaking past on the street below, a neighbour's rooster answering the call in its own uncomprehending fashion, the distant, familiar clatter of a bakery's ovens being fed for the morning's first bread. It's around 1611, and you've been Yusuf now, the name you took alongside your captain, alongside most of his surviving crew, for close to a year. The house you wake in is modest by the standards of the wealthiest merchants in this city, but it is entirely, unmistakably yours, built of pale limestone with a small interior courtyard where you've started, somewhat to your own surprise, to grow herbs in clay pots, mint, mostly, and a stubborn little rosemary bush that took 3 attempts to keep alive. You never owned a single stone of anything back in England. You do now. Before you leave the house at all, there's a small ritual you've kept from your old life without ever quite explaining it to anyone in your new one. A letter, begun most weeks, and finished only some of them, addressed to a sister back in Kent who has no real way to write back even if she wanted to. You've heard second-hand through the same merchant network that carries goods and gossip in equal measure between Tunias and the English ports, that your captain does something similar, quietly and consistently, sending money to the English wife he left behind years ago, even now, years into a second marriage to an Italian woman here in Tunis, even years into a new name and a new faith and a new life that has, by any outward measure, replaced the old one entirely. Nobody in your circle talks about it much, out of a kind of unspoken respect, but everyone knows. It is, you've come to think, the strangest and most stubbornly decent thing about the man, that whatever else piracy and conversion and reinvention stripped away from him, he never let it strip away the specific obligation of a husband to a wife he can no longer live beside. You keep writing your own unanswerable letters partly, you suspect, because watching him do the same thing has made you feel less foolish for doing it. Getting dressed is its own small daily negotiation between the man you were and the man you've become. The turban takes practice. You've wrapped it wrong more mornings than you'd like to admit, and the older renegades in your circle still find your clumsiness with it quietly funny, but the coat underneath it is still, stubbornly, cut in something close to an Englishman's fashion, because some habits of the hand simply don't unlearn themselves as fast as the mind does. You catch your own reflection in a polished brass bowl some mornings, and genuinely startle at it, a stranger wearing your face, before the moment passes and you go on getting dressed. Breakfast is bread and olives and a strong, dark drink the locals have introduced you to that some of the English renegades have taken to calling by its Turkish name, unable to find any word in their own language that quite fits it. It's bitter the first dozen times you try it, and something closer to essential by the 50th, the way most things about this new life have gone, jarring at first. Then, simply how a morning starts. What you do not drink, this morning or any morning since your conversion, is wine, not because it's been forbidden to you by force, but because you made the choice yourself, alongside the larger choice of faith it came bundled with, and you've noticed, with a certain wry surprise, how much steadier your hands have been in the year since you stopped. Your own captain, the man who brought you to this city in the first place, was famous back in England for exactly the opposite habit. A legendary drunkard, by every report that ever reached London, the kind of reputation that outlived any actual detail about the man himself. You've heard him joke about it more than once, in that flat, self-mocking way he has, composing little rhymes about his own transformation for anyone who'll listen. The ward who drank himself half to death in English taverns, and the sober, turbaned man who now runs half this city's corsair trade, are, by his own account, barely the same person anymore. And you believe him, because you've watched your own transformation happen the same way, one small, daily choice at a time. Market day pulls you out into the city properly, and it's still, after a year, the part of this new life that most reliably takes your breath away. The souk near the Medina spills over with goods you'd never have seen in a Kentish market in 100 years, cones of sugar from further along the coast, bolts of silk still carrying the smell of the ship that brought them, spices whose names you're only slowly learning, birds in wicker cages sold for meat, for pets, and in a handful of specialty stalls for something closer to a serious hobby. You've learned to haggle in a mixture of broken Arabic and hand gestures that would have embarrassed you a year ago and now barely registers as strange, learned which stallholders remember you and extend a small. Genuine welcome, learned the specific sound a good melon makes when you thump it that no fruit back in Faversham ever quite matched. A pound of good pepper, you've discovered, costs here a fraction of what it would fetch back in an English market after it had crossed half the known world and passed through a dozen merchants' hands, one of the quieter, less dramatic reasons men like your captain found this trade worth the risk in the first place, long before any single prize like the great Venetian argosy ever entered the picture. Your captain, everyone in this quarter of the city knows, has developed a genuine obsession with birds since settling here, pigeons, hens, anything he can keep and study, and word has spread that he's taken to experimenting with ways of hatching eggs artificially, tending them by controlled warmth, rather than waiting on a hen to do the work herself. A hobby so specific and so strange for a former pirate admiral that even the locals have taken to half joking about it, some of them swearing they've seen him more animated discussing a broody hen's temperament than he ever was, by reputation, discussing a captured cargo's worth. It's the detail that earned him his nickname back in England before any of the rest of this happened, Birdie, and it turns out, watching him fuss over a clutch of eggs with the same focus he once brought to reading a chase across open water, that the nickname was never really a joke at all. Some men take up gardening in their later years. Ward took up incubating chickens. By mid-morning, the business of the day proper gets underway, and this is where the fantasy most people back home carry about renegade life collides hardest with the reality of it. You are not idle. You are not lounging in some imagined harem of endless leisure the London pamphlets are so eager to describe. You have accounts to keep, cargo to help assess, a share of the corsair trade's genuinely tedious paperwork to manage alongside men who were, a year or two ago, exactly the kind of English sailors you grew up alongside, and alongside Janissary officials who watch the renegade community with an expression you've learned to read as careful, unresolved appraisal, neither fully trusting you nor fully rejecting you. One of the men you work alongside most days is an Englishman of a very different background than yours entirely, a nobleman by birth, one of the 4 captains who commanded ships under Ward's fleet, a man who left England after a bitter inheritance dispute cost him his family estate, and who found, in this same corsair world that took you in as a common sailor, a second chance he'd never have gotten back in an England obsessed with birth and title. It still faintly amuses you, some mornings, that this world you both fled into has made you in most practical respects his equal, the same turban, the same faith, the same uncertain welcome from a city that needs your skills more than it fully trusts your loyalty. You are, in the plainest terms, a man without a country, tolerated in this one because you're useful, never quite certain how permanent that tolerance actually is. There are 15 of you now, by one visiting traveller's careful count, 15 circumcised English runagates, as he rather bluntly puts it in the journal he's keeping of his travels, living under Ward's protection in various stages of adjustment to a life none of you were raised to expect. You've become close, in the specific way people become close when they share a genuinely unusual circumstance, and nobody else on either side of the Mediterranean fully understands what it's like to be you. A bond that has nothing to do with where any of you started out, and everything to do with where you've all ended up. Among them is a man named Richard Bishop, who arrived in Tunis not long after Ward himself did, one of the earliest Englishmen to settle here and build something like a permanent life of his own, and it's Bishop, more than anyone else in your circle, who's taught you the practical mechanics of surviving in this city as what you now are, which merchants can be trusted, which local customs carry real weight, and which a merely polite theatre how to hold yourself in a room full of Janissary officers so you read as confident without reading as a threat. Bishop has a habit, when the day's work is done, of gathering whichever of the 15 happen to be free that evening for a game with dice carved from bone. Played for stakes so small, they're really just an excuse to sit together and talk in English for an hour, the one language none of you have to think twice about here. It is, in its own modest way, the closest thing your circle has to a tavern back home, minus the tavern, minus the ale, minus almost everything except the company. And it turns out the company was most of what you actually missed. More than the ale ever was, if you're honest with yourself about it. There's a newer arrival among you, a boy barely 16 who came ashore only weeks ago aboard one of the fleet's more recent prizes, choosing conversion over an uncertain wait for a ransom his family could likely never afford, and watching him fumble through his first attempts at Bishop's dice game. Laughing too loud at jokes he only half understands yet, you're struck by how quickly this strange, improvised brotherhood absorbs each new arrival, not because anyone here has forgotten what it cost to join it, but because everyone here remembers exactly how much it helped, in those first disorienting weeks, to have somewhere to sit that didn't feel entirely foreign. The traveller keeping that careful count of you, a Scotsman restless and endlessly curious, working his way through what will eventually become 19 years of wandering 3 continents on foot, has come through Tunis this particular week specifically to see your captain in person, and you watch the two of them together with a strange, detached fascination. Because it's like watching your old life and your new one shake hands across a table neither man is fully comfortable at. You linger nearby longer than you probably should, half out of curiosity about how your captain presents himself to a visiting countryman, half because the Scotsman has a restless, questioning energy that reminds you, oddly, of the man you were before any of this happened. Someone still hungry to understand a world he hadn't yet given up on. The Scotsman asks Ward, more or less directly, whether the stories about his drunkenness are true, and Ward answers with one of his little self-composed rhymes, delivered completely deadpan, about drinking water like a donkey and being shod like a horse, and the Scotsman writes the whole exchange down. Amused and slightly bewildered, in the very journal that will end up, centuries later, being one of the only first-hand descriptions anyone has of what your captain actually looked and sounded like in these years. Short, balding, sun-weathered, swearing constantly out of long habit even though the drink that used to fuel it is gone. You notice, watching this exchange, that Ward seems almost to enjoy being misunderstood this way, performing the very legend the London pamphlets built around him, with a wink that only someone who stood this close to him would ever catch. Not every relationship in this city is as easy as an evening game of dice, and it would be dishonest to pretend your welcome here has ever been entirely unconditional, however comfortable the courtyard and the herbs and the market mornings have made the rest of it feel. There is a genuine, if mostly unspoken, hierarchy at play in Tunis between men born into the faith and men like you who arrived at it by choice and by circumstance, and you feel it most sharply in small moments rather than large ones. A merchant who deals with you fairly but never quite as warmly as he does with a Tunisian-born customer. A Janissary officer who addresses you correctly and respectfully and still, somehow, manages to make clear with nothing more than his tone and the set of his shoulders that he considers you a useful outsider rather than a true countryman. You don't resent it, exactly, though it took the better part of your first year here to stop flinching at it. You understand, better than you'd like to, what it is to watch a newcomer arrive and wonder how much of his loyalty is real and how much is simply the loyalty of a man with nowhere else left to go. You've started to suspect that every renegade in this city carries some version of the same quiet awareness, that your safety here is a standing arrangement, not a birthright, and that arrangements, unlike birthrights, can always in principle be renegotiated. Even Ward, for all his wealth and standing, isn't fully exempt from this. You've noticed how carefully he still defers to Uthman Dey in public, how quick he is to make sure the older man's cut arrives correctly and on time, a small daily performance of loyalty from a man who has learned, the hard way, exactly what it costs to lose a patron's trust. You've come to think of it less as suspicion and more as simple, mutual pragmatism. Nobody in this arrangement, from Uthman Day down to the newest boy in your circle, is under any illusion that the whole structure runs on anything sturdier than continued usefulness. A lesson every one of you learned the moment you first watched a merchant weigh your own hands like livestock on the quay at La. Goulet. Afternoon prayers pull the whole quarter briefly quiet. A rhythm you've come to find, somewhat to your own surprise, genuinely steadying rather than burdensome. 5 fixed points in a day that otherwise has no fixed points at all. No bells, no watch bells, nothing but the sun and this. You still catch yourself, on the hardest days, missing the specific cadence of an English Sunday service, the hymns you knew by heart before you knew you'd ever leave the country that taught them to you. You've never told anyone in your junior circle that. You suspect, without ever having asked, that most of the 15 of you are carrying some version of the exact same private, unspoken homesickness, wrapped up in whatever new rhythm has replaced the old one. Evening brings you back to your small courtyard, herbs faintly fragrant in the cooling air, and it's here, most nights, that the strangest part of this whole transformation settles over you most clearly. You are, by any honest measure, safer and wealthier than you have ever been in your life, living under the protection of a ruler who has kept every promise he's made to your community, even when it cost him politically to do so, surrounded by men who understand exactly what you gave up to be here. You think, some evenings, about the sailor you were on that first voyage under Ward's flag, seasick and terrified and certain you'd never see anything but the inside of a rolling wooden hull for the rest of your short, probably violent life. That man could not have imagined this courtyard, this quiet, this strange, hard-won ordinariness. And you would still, if you're being completely honest with yourself on a quiet evening like this one, go home tomorrow, if home were still a door that opened for you. It isn't. It hasn't been for a long time, not since a king's refusal closed it, not since a faith and a name and a decade reshaped you into someone your own mother, if she's still living, likely wouldn't recognise on sight. What you have instead is this: a courtyard, a captain who talks to his chickens, 14 other Englishmen who understand precisely what you've lost, and a life that, against every reasonable expectation you carried onto that first pirate ship years ago, turned out to be worth living after all. It is not the life anyone back in Faversham or Fowey or wherever you started would recognise as a good one. It is, nonetheless, yours, built stone by stone and choice by choice, in a city that took you in when your own country wouldn't, and some nights watching the last light go gold over the courtyard wall, that turns out to be enough. Enough, at least, to close your eyes without the old dread of wondering what tomorrow's watch or tomorrow's chase might cost you. Because for the first time since you left an English dock behind, tomorrow is simply going to be another ordinary day. Every quiet evening in that courtyard existed alongside a much louder, much less accurate version of Ward's life that was being sold, sung, and staged back in England the entire time, and it's that louder version, the pamphlets and ballads and stage plays, that turned a Kentish fisherman's son into a national bogeyman and eventually a folk hero that we need to untangle next. Picture the scene as it likely played out, because a letter carried across an entire sea to reach a man like Ward wasn't a small undertaking, and neither. Probably was his answer. Shirley's message would have arrived by the hand of some merchant intermediary or ship's captain, willing to carry correspondence into a Corsair port, delivered to Ward in whatever room he was conducting business in that day, read aloud perhaps by one of the 15 Englishmen in his circle for a captain whose own letters, if we're honest about a fisherman's education, he may not have been entirely confident reading unassisted. Better, Ward reportedly told the visiting envoy who came seeking his answer in the summer of 1607 to live among the Turks than fall into the hands of Christians. It's a line short enough to remember and pointed enough that it survived in some form across multiple retellings. The Englishman doing the asking was Sir Anthony Shirley, a well-travelled adventurer and diplomat who had written to Ward not as an enemy but as something closer to a concerned countryman. urging him to abandon what Shirley called his degrading and wicked lifestyle and rejoin the Christian cause against the very Ottoman power Ward now served. It was, on paper, exactly the kind of appeal that might have worked on a man still weighing his options. Ward's reply, paraphrased across several surviving accounts but consistent in its substance, wasn't defiance exactly. It was something closer to a considered business decision, delivered by a man who had already done the arithmetic on which side of that religious and political line actually kept its promises to men like him. That exchange happened before the Sodorina's desertion, before the refused pardon, before Ward's formal conversion, which makes it worth pausing on, because it tells you Ward's eventual break with England wasn't a single dramatic rupture, but a decision he was circling, out loud, for years before he finally committed to it. By the time King James issued his formal royal proclamation against piracy on the 8th of January 1609, naming Ward specifically among the pirates England wanted stopped, the Crown was, in effect, publicly confirming what Ward had already told Shirley privately 2 years earlier. There was no path back that didn't require him to surrender everything he'd built. And increasingly, no reason to think England actually wanted him back badly enough to make that surrender worthwhile. It is worth noting, too, that Shirley himself was hardly a straightforward moral authority to be lecturing anyone about wicked lifestyles. An adventurer with his own complicated history of mercenary service, diplomatic intrigue, and shifting allegiance across half the courts of Europe and Asia, which makes his letter to Ward read less like a clean appeal from virtue to vice, and more like one restless, reinvented Englishman writing to another, each of them having found, in his own way, that the old categories of loyal subject and traitor simply didn't describe the world either of them was actually living in anymore. The proclamation lit a fire under London's pamphlet trade that had already been smouldering for years, and nobody fanned those flames more effectively, or with a clearer personal grudge, than a captain named Andrew Barker. You've met him already, in passing, the English merchant whose ship, the York Bonaventure, was seized by Ward's lieutenant William Graves, an act of piracy that cost Barker his vessel, his cargo, and very nearly his life. Barker's response, once he'd made his way back to England, was to write and publish a true and certain report of the beginning, proceedings, overthrows, and now present a state of Captain Ward and Danziger, a pamphlet that became the single most influential account of Ward's career in print, and one that, by Barker's own admission in its preface, was never meant to be a neutral history. It was meant to satisfy an English readership's appetite for seeing pirates punished, even if only on paper. The pamphlet's cover woodcut illustrates the point vividly. It depicts in stark black and white both Ward and Danziger hanging from the masts of their own ships, executed for their crimes. Neither man had, at the time of publication, been captured, tried, or executed by anyone. Ward was, in point of fact, living in considerable comfort in Tunis at that exact moment. The woodcut wasn't reporting news. It was selling wish fulfillment to an audience that badly wanted the story to end a certain way, dressed up with just enough factual detail about Ward's real exploits to feel like reportage rather than fantasy. To understand why a single pamphlet like Barker's could shape an entire nation's picture of a man none of its readers would ever meet, it helps to understand what the pamphlet trade actually was in Jacobean London. These were cheap, disposable publications, sold for a penny or two on street corners and in bookstalls around St. Paul's churchyard, written fast, printed fast, and consumed by a reading public larger and more literate than most people assume for this period, thanks to a century of grammar school expansion and a genuine popular hunger for news of the wider world that had no other reliable way of learning what was happening across the Mediterranean. There was no newspaper in the modern sense, no consistent foreign correspondent filing dispatches. A pamphlet like Barker's wasn't competing against other more careful accounts of Ward's life. For most English readers, it simply was the account, uncontested and largely unquestioned, which is exactly how a wronged merchant's grudge became, almost by default, the historical record. It's worth sitting with what it means that the man who wrote the definitive account of Ward's crimes was also the man with the strongest personal motive in England to make those crimes sound as monstrous as possible. Barker wasn't lying about the broad shape of Ward's career. The ships, the dates, the captures Barker describes largely line up with what other, less personally invested sources confirm. But every value judgment layered on top of those facts, every claim about Ward's character, every lurid detail about supposed depravity in Tunis, comes from a man who had every reason in the world to want his readers to hate the pirate who ruined him. This is, in miniature, the exact problem that dogs almost everything we know about John Ward. The closer a source stood to genuine hatred or genuine fascination with the man, the less we can trust its restraint. And Ward inspired plenty of the opposite reaction too, which makes the pamphlet war considerably stranger than a simple story of villain versus victim. London's street balladeers, working a very different commercial angle than Barker's grudge-fueled pamphlet, found in Ward something closer to a folk anti-hero, a common man who had, through nerve and audacity, risen from nothing to command a fleet richer than most noblemen ever saw in their lives. One surviving ballad calls him, without apparent irony, the most famous pirate of the world, and an Englishman born, sung to tunes that would have carried through taverns from London to Bristol, celebrating exactly the crimes the Crown's own proclamation was simultaneously condemning. These songs were, by their nature, ephemeral, sung, half-remembered, revised in the retelling the way folk material always is, and only a handful survive in printed form today. Broadsides that some enterprising publisher thought worth setting in type precisely because the tune was already popular enough on the street to guarantee sales. That a pirate's exploits could sustain a market for printed sheet music at all tells you something about just how far his fame had actually travelled beyond the merchant class Barker was writing for. The audience for this version of Ward's story looked nothing like the merchant class readers of Barker's pamphlet. These were dock workers, apprentices, common sailors themselves, men who understood, in a way no comfortable London merchant ever could, exactly how thin the line was between the naval service that paid them 10 shillings a month and the piracy that had made a fisherman's son richer, than anyone in their neighbourhood was ever likely to become honestly. For them, Ward wasn't a moral catastrophe. He was proof of concept. It's a contradiction that tells you something true about English society in these years. Officially, Ward was a traitor and a scandal. Unofficially, in the mouths of ordinary sailors and dockside singers, who understood better than any court official just how thin the line was between an honest privateer and a hunted pirate, he was proof that a poor man's son could still, against every odd stacked against him, become something the whole world had to reckon with. The stage got its version of Ward too, and arguably the most sophisticated one, when the playwright Robert de Born staged A Christian Turned Turk in London in 1612, a drama built entirely around Ward's conversion, drawing directly on the pamphlets already circulating about him, and dramatising the religious scandal of turning Turk for an audience deeply anxious about exactly that possibility. English authorities in this period were genuinely, seriously worried about the number of their countrymen choosing conversion and a corsair's life over ransom, poverty or death, and de Born's play functioned less as entertainment alone than as a kind of cautionary civic theatre. Look, the play seemed to say, at what happens to a man who trades his faith for gold and comfort. De Born wasn't working from any direct knowledge of Ward himself. By his own later correspondence with theatre managers, he leaned heavily on exactly the same two hostile pamphlets that had already shaped Barker's version of events, meaning London audiences watching the play were, in effect, watching a dramatisation of a dramatisation. Several layers removed from anything resembling a first-hand account, that the real Ward, 600 miles away in Tunis, was at that exact moment living a life considerably more stable and prosperous than most of the London audience watching his fictional downfall on stage, is the kind of irony that pamphlet writers of the period were rarely inclined to examine too closely. Clergymen took up the same material from an entirely different pulpit, quite literally, and their version of Ward's story leaned even further from anything resembling balanced reporting. Sermons condemning Ward by name survive from these years, warning congregations that his fate, imagined since nobody preaching these sermons had any real information about what Ward's actual daily life in Tunis looked like, would surely end in drunkenness, moral ruin, and eventual damnation within what one preacher called the sybaritic confines of his Tunisian palace. It is one of the stranger ironies buried in this whole print and pulpit campaign against him that the England condemning Ward so thoroughly for supposed depravity had, by the account of the one visitor who actually met him in person, gotten the specific accusation of drunkenness backward by the time most of these sermons were still being preached. Congregations were being warned, from the pulpit, about vices their target had already given up years before, a mismatch between rumour and reality that nobody in England was in any position to notice or correct. Ward, for his part, appears to have known exactly what his reputation had become back home, and made at least one serious attempt to trade on it for something concrete. According to accounts that survive from these years, he offered at one point to give up piracy entirely in exchange for a formal amnesty and a payment of £40,000, an audacious proposal that reads, on its face, less like a criminal seeking forgiveness than like a man who understood his own market value and was trying to negotiate accordingly. Set that figure against the value of the Sodorina's cargo alone, and Ward's asking price looks less like extortion and more like a rounding error against what England had already, in effect, lost to him. A fact that surely wasn't lost on whichever royal adviser eventually had to weigh the proposal. The English Crown, for all its public condemnation, apparently gave the offer real consideration before ultimately declining it, wary of both the diplomatic cost of rewarding a pirate so openly and the practical near impossibility of actually collecting on whatever debts or restitution such a deal might have implied. It's a remarkable footnote precisely because it shows Ward thinking, even at the height of his outlaw fame, less like the folk legend the ballads were building, and more like exactly what he'd always been underneath the legend. A fisherman's son who understood the value of a good trade when he saw one. All of which brings us, finally, to the man whose account gives us the clearest, closest look at Ward the actual human being, rather than Ward the pamphlet villain, or Ward the ballad hero, the Scottish traveller William Lithgow, who visited Tunis in September of 1615, during the second of what would eventually become 3 enormous overland peregrinations across Europe, Asia and Africa. Journeys he would later claim covered some 36,000 miles on foot across a 19-year span, an almost unbelievable feat of endurance that eventually earned him, alongside a reputation for genuine curiosity, a reputation for occasionally embellishing a story past what the facts alone could support. Lithgow sought Ward out specifically, curious to meet the most notorious English renegade alive, and what he recorded deserves to be read carefully, weighed against everything else this chapter has already said about hostile pamphlets and romanticising ballads, because it complicates the too drunk to die legend this whole story is named for in a way that's more interesting than a simple debunking. Lithgow's credibility on this particular subject is worth establishing plainly, because so much of what survives about Ward comes from men who never laid eyes on him. Lithgow did. He spent real time in Ward's company, ate at his table by at least one account, and was granted a safe conduct pass by Ward himself to continue on toward the considerably more dangerous city of Algiers, a practical kindness from a man Lithgow otherwise had every literary incentive to render as a monster, the way Barker and De Bourne had. That Lithgow instead gives us a portrait closer to a tired, sardonic old man than a swaggering villain suggests something genuine survived the encounter intact, however much Lithgow's prose elsewhere in his travelogue tends toward the dramatic. Lithgow describes a man in his early 60s by then, very short, with little hair, and that quite white, bald in front, swarthy from decades in the Mediterranean sun, a man who spoke little and swore constantly out of what reads like decades of ingrained naval habit. It's a description that could easily have come from a hostile pamphleteer looking to diminish a feared enemy into something small and unimpressive, except that Lithgow, by his own account, liked the man well enough to accept his hospitality and his help, which lends the physical description a kind of accidental credibility the pamphlets never earn, a small, unglamorous man, well past his prime, who nonetheless still commanded enough respect in that city that a foreign traveller thought him worth seeking out by name, And on the specific question of drink, the reputation that had, by this point, followed Ward across 2 decades of pamphlets and ballads, Lithgow reports something that should genuinely surprise anyone who's only ever heard the drunkard version of Ward's legend. By 1615, Ward drank neither wine nor ale nor any strong spirit at all. His conversion to Islam had brought with it, for Ward at least, a real and apparently lasting abstinence, and Lithgow records Ward composing, on the spot, a wry little rhyme about his own transformation, comparing himself, with evident self-mockery, to a donkey drinking water, a horse in his studded Turkish shoes, a fool in his opulent Turkish coat, an owl under his turban. This is, in other words, a former legendary drunkard who had, by every account from someone who actually met him, been stone sober for years by the time most of the ballads about his drinking were still being sung back in England. Here is where the too drunk to die premise of this whole story needs to be handled with real honesty, rather than left standing as literal fact. There is no documented account, anywhere in the surviving record, of John Ward surviving an execution, a hanging, a firing squad, or any other attempt on his life specifically because he was too intoxicated to be affected by it. That version of the phrase, the one that sounds like a single dramatic historical incident, appears to be exactly what it looks like, a piece of modern legend building, the kind of vivid, quotable claim that spreads because it's a better story than the messier truth. It's worth being direct about that gap between headline and history, rather than quietly hoping the audience won't notice. Because the honest version turns out to be more interesting anyway, not less. A real man's real documented transformation beats a made-up execution scene every time, once you actually sit with it. The truth, as best the record allows us to reconstruct it, is stranger and in some ways more remarkable than the legend. Ward's reputation as a drunkard was real and widely reported while he still lived and drank in England and in his early years abroad, was seized on and exaggerated by pamphleteers with every reason to paint him as a moral degenerate, and then was quietly, dramatically reversed by the man himself once he converted, a transformation so thorough that a Scottish traveller could sit across from him a decade later and find, instead of the legendary sot the ballads promised, a sober, self-deprecating, sharp-tongued old man composing verse about his own reformed habits. What actually kept Ward alive all those years wasn't drink or the lack of it at all. It was politics, Uthman Day's patronage, a king's calculated refusal to make an enemy of Venice, the sheer economic usefulness of a skilled captain to a ruler who valued results over reputation. Sobriety didn't save him from a rope any more than drunkenness once nearly cost him one. No rope was ever seriously in the offing to begin with, English proclamations and hostile woodcuts notwithstanding. Too drunk to die isn't a documented fact about John Ward. It's a legend built from a real reputation, exaggerated by hostile pamphleteers, and then, in the most ironic possible twist, quietly outlived by the very man it was invented to describe, a man who spent his final years, as we're about to see, sober, wealthy, and very much still alive, while the ballads about his drinking kept right on being sung. The legend outlived the accuracy, as legends tend to do, and it would keep right on outliving it for the next 400 years. But before we follow that legend all the way to a modern movie franchise, we need to finish the actual story, because Ward's own ending, unglamorous and quiet as it turned out to be, deserves to be told as carefully and as honestly as everything that came before it, without the pamphleteer's dramatic flourishes and without the ballad-maker's romance either. Cannon fire lit up the harbour at La Goulette before dawn on the day the Spanish fleet finally came for Tunis in earnest. Men who had spent the previous evening in their own beds, in houses not unlike the one you spent an evening in a few chapters ago, woke instead to the concussion of naval guns, finding point-blank range against ships that had never expected an attack this size, this early, this close to home. There would have been no 3-hour running battle this time, no chance for a captain's seamanship to even the odds against superior tonnage the way Ward had once done off Cyprus, no wind to dance in and out of range with. This was an ambush executed at anchor, ships caught with sails furled and crews half-dressed. the kind of one-sided violence that makes the Soderinas desperate. Smoke-choked engagement look almost fair by comparison. It was January of 1609, and Admiral Luis Fajardo had brought 8 galleons, 2 carracks, a caravel, and a frigate. 22 armed ships in total, backed by some 20,000 land soldiers waiting in reserve, against a corsair fleet anchored in port, and, for one catastrophic morning, almost entirely unprepared for an attack of this scale. It was, by most reckonings, the first major naval operation in Mediterranean history fought entirely with sailing ships rather than the all-powered galleys that had dominated the sea for centuries. A changing of the guard in naval technology playing out, almost incidentally, in the middle of what was fundamentally a punitive raid against men like Ward. A quiet historical footnote riding along inside a much louder catastrophe. When the smoke cleared, 21 corsair vessels lay destroyed or captured in the harbour, against a Spanish loss of just 3 men killed and 40 wounded. A lopsided catastrophe that cost the combined pirate fleets of Tunis, Ward's own ships very likely among the casualties. More in a single morning than years of individual captures and losses combined. Ward survived the raid. The record is clear on that much, since we know he lived on for over a decade afterward, but the scale of the damage to Tunis's corsair fleet as a whole was a sobering reminder, delivered with brutal clarity, of exactly how precarious even the most successful renegade's position really was. All the gold from the Soderina, all the careful diplomacy with Uthman Dey, all the accumulated fame from a decade of captures, and still a single well-planned morning raid by a European power could reduce the fleet Ward had helped build to smoking wreckage riding at anchor before most of the harbour had even finished waking up. It would happen again, less catastrophically but with the same underlying message, in 1617, when another Spanish force under Ottavio d'Aragona struck La Goulette a second time, destroying whatever corsair vessels it found in port with the same brisk, punitive efficiency. Tunis, for all its wealth and all its powerful renegade captains, was never actually safe. It was simply, on most days, lucky. Not every English renegade who sailed under Ward's flag lived to see the quieter decade that followed. Among the 4 captains who commanded ships within Ward's larger fleet was an English nobleman named Francis Verney, a man who had left England after a bitter inheritance dispute cost him his family estate, and who found, in the corsair world, a second chance no English court would ever have granted him. Verney converted alongside Ward around 1610, part of the same wave of mass conversion that swept through Ward's entire circle. But his fortune ran in the opposite direction from his captain's, a divergence worth pausing on for what it says about how unevenly this world distributed its rewards even among men who started as near equals within the same fleet under the same flag. Captured not long afterward, Verney spent 2 brutal years chained to a rowing bench as a galley slave in Sicily, a fate considerably closer to what awaited an ordinary captured sailor than what any of Ward's own inner circle typically faced, before an English Jesuit priest, moved by his plight, arranged his rescue in 1614. Verney converted back to Catholicism shortly before his death the following year, in Messina, at just 31 years old, worn out, by every account, well before his time by the 2 years he'd spent as a slave rather than a captain. His story stands as a quiet, necessary corrective to Ward's own relatively soft landing. Piracy's rewards were real, but they were never evenly distributed. And even among men who started this life as social equals within the same fleet, fortune could and did turn as differently as it turned for Danziger and Ward themselves. Ward's own activity as a raiding captain appears to have wound down significantly after these disasters, and the record of his final decade grows correspondingly quieter, not because anyone stopped watching him, but because there was, increasingly, less dramatic to report. Sometime around 1615, the year Lithgow found him composing wry verse about donkeys and owls. Most sources agree Ward's documented involvement in active piracy had already effectively ceased. He remained wealthy. He remained, by most accounts, comfortable and secure in Uthman Dey's favour, a settled elder statesman of the corsair world rather than an active predator in it. But the fisherman's son, who had once declared himself sole commander of the seas, was by his 60s, increasingly a retired admiral rather than an active one, tending to business interests, his household, and, by every surviving account, his birds. That last detail deserves more than a passing mention, because it's one of the strangest and most oddly endearing footnotes in this entire story. Ward, the man nicknamed Birdie back in England for reasons nobody bothered to fully explain in the surviving pamphlets, appears to have carried a genuine, lasting fascination with birds into his years of retirement in Tunis, and local tradition credits him with experimenting, seriously and with real technical curiosity, in early methods of incubating eggs artificially, tending them by controlled. Sustained warmth, rather than leaving the work entirely to a hen. Picture it plainly, because the image deserves a moment of real attention rather than a quick joke and a move on. A man who once ordered chain shot fired into the largest ship in the eastern Mediterranean, now spending unhurried mornings adjusting the warmth around a clutch of eggs. Checking them the way he once checked a chaser's bearing. Patient in a way nothing in his documented younger life ever suggested he could be. It is a strange, almost domestic footnote to attach to a man whose earlier career had involved chain shot and burning cotton bales. And it should be read with appropriate caution, since the source for this particular detail comes down to us as local heritage tradition rather than a contemporary document with a name and a date attached. But even treated as legend rather than certified fact, it fits everything else we know about the man too well to dismiss outright. A fisherman's son, obsessed since boyhood with the sea and its creatures, who spent a violent middle age tearing apart other people's ships, and then spent his old age, comfortable and finally safe, patiently coaxing new life out of an egg. He never stopped sending money to his English wife, even now, even this deep into a second life, a second marriage, a second name, and a second faith. It is worth returning to this detail one final time, because it is the single most consistent thread running through everything else we know about Ward, from the earliest surviving accounts of his career through the very last. Somewhere in Kent, for nearly 2 decades, a woman who had married an ordinary fisherman received, at increasingly irregular but never entirely absent intervals, money from a husband she likely never saw again after 1603. Money that meant, whatever else had happened to the man who sent it, she was never left destitute by his choices the way so many wives of vanished sailors and soldiers were in this period. We don't know her name. We don't know whether she ever learned the full extent of what her husband had become, the conversion, the second marriage, the fortune and its slow decline. What we know is that the money kept arriving, year after year, a strange and stubborn thread of ordinary decency running underneath a life built almost entirely on its opposite. Whatever else piracy, conversion and reinvention took from him or gave him, he never once, as far as any surviving record shows, simply let that particular obligation lapse. It is a strange kind of loyalty to find buried inside a career built on betrayal and theft, quiet, unglamorous, utterly unmentioned by the ballads that preferred him as either monster or hero, and probably more revealing of the actual man than either version the pamphlets sold. Ward's fortune, by most accounts, had diminished considerably by the final years of his life, not vanished entirely, but eroded by the same combination of factors that eroded most great pirate fortunes of this era. The loss of ships and cargo in the 1609 and 1617 raids, the ordinary costs of maintaining a household and a position in a foreign court for over a decade, and the simple fact that a man no longer actively raiding is a man no longer bringing in new plunder to replace what's spent. Ward's fortune, by most accounts, had diminished considerably by the final years of his life, not vanished entirely, but eroded by the same combination of factors that eroded most great pirate fortunes of this era. The loss of ships and cargo in the 1609 and 1617 raids, the ordinary costs of maintaining a household and a position in a foreign court for over a decade, and the simple fact that a man no longer actively raiding is a man no longer bringing in new plunder to replace what's spent. Wealth built on plunder, it turns out, behaves very differently from wealth built on land or trade. There is no harvest to replant, no shop to restock, only a finite hoard slowly, steadily drawn down by the ordinary costs of simply continuing to live comfortably. The richest pirate of his generation spent his final years, by this account, not poor exactly, but noticeably diminished from the man who had once outfitted a 60-gun warship on a whim. He died in Tunis around 1622, at roughly 70 years of age, and the most consistent account of his death attributes it to plague, one of the periodic epidemics that swept through Mediterranean port cities with grim regularity in this period. Indifferent to wealth, faith, or reputation. There is no surviving record of his burial site, no monument marks where the wealthiest English pirate of his generation was laid to rest, no headstone, no inscription, nothing a modern visitor could stand before and point to. A man who had once commanded 60 bronze cannon and a fortune estimated, by some accounts, at close to £2 million died, in the end, the way an enormous number of ordinary people in this era died, quietly, of disease, without ceremony, in a city that had given him almost everything except, in the final accounting, a lasting monument. Compare that to the elaborate, if largely fictional, execution the 1609 pamphlet woodcut once imagined for him, Ward hanging from his own mast for the satisfaction of an English readership, the real ending. 13 years later, and an ocean of rumour removed from that image, turned out to be smaller, quieter, and far less dramatic than anything the pamphleteers had ever dared print. No woodcut artist in London ever thought to sketch a wealthy old man dying quietly of fever in his own bed, because a peaceful death was never the ending their readers were paying to see. There is something worth sitting with in that particular absence. Ward spent decades building a legend loud enough to fill an entire ballad tradition, and in the end the physical trace of the actual man simply dissolved into the same anonymous ground that swallowed everyone else the plague took that year. Rich pirate and poor fisherman alike, the sea that made his fortune having nothing whatsoever to do with how he actually left the world. What didn't die with him was the story, and the story's afterlife turned out to be considerably longer and considerably stranger than Ward's actual life ever was. The ballads kept circulating for decades after his death, gradually detaching from any specific memory of the real events they claimed to describe, and settling into the broader English folk tradition of pirate songs. Sung and reshaped by singers who likely had no idea, by the time another generation had passed, that Ward the pirate had ever been a real, documented, specific human being rather than a stock figure of maritime legend. De Bourne's play faded from the active stage, but survived in print. One small data point in the much larger 17th century English literary fascination with Barbary corsairs, conversion, and the anxious, fascinated relationship England's popular imagination maintained with the Ottoman world throughout this period. Historians picked up the thread periodically over the following centuries, piecing Ward's career back together from the same scattered pamphlets, proclamations, and travellers' accounts that this whole script has been drawing from. Barker's hostile testimony, Lithgow's eyewitness account, the diplomatic correspondence of ambassadors in Venice and London who spent years trying to track a man who never once, after 1608, set foot anywhere they could reach him. Historians picked up the thread periodically over the following centuries, piecing Ward's career back together from the same scattered pamphlets, proclamations, and travellers' accounts that this whole script has been drawing from, Barker's hostile testimony, Lithgow's eyewitness account, the diplomatic correspondence of ambassadors in Venice and London who spent years trying to track a man who never once, after 1608, set foot anywhere they could reach him. It's worth being plain about what that reconstruction actually looks like in practice, because it isn't glamorous archival detective work so much as careful, patient cross-referencing, a merchant's letter here confirming a ship's capture date, a royal proclamation there confirming a name and a wanted status, an ambassador's dispatch cross checked against a pamphlet's claim to see where the two agree and where one is clearly exaggerating. No single document tells Ward's whole story. What survives is a scattered, contradictory paper trail left behind by people who mostly hated him, occasionally admired him, and almost never simply observed him without an agenda of their own. Which is exactly why a source like Lithgow's, flawed and occasionally embellished as it is, carries such disproportionate weight in any honest telling. It's one of vanishingly few accounts written by someone who had nothing much to gain either way from making Ward look better or worse than he actually was. And then, nearly 400 years after his death, John Ward's name resurfaced in an entirely unexpected context. In the years following the release of Disney's Pirates of the Caribbean films, a handful of historians and popular writers, the British author Giles Milton prominent among them, began pointing out the striking parallels between Ward's documented biography and the character of Captain Jack Sparrow, an Englishman turned pirate, a man of considerable charm and audacity. Someone whose nicknames included, in some period sources, a variation on Sparrow alongside his more common Birdie, and whose career of dramatic reinvention, foreign alliance, and narrow survival against overwhelming odds echoes, in broad outline, exactly the kind of swashbuckling improbability the films built their most famous character around. It's worth stating plainly, though, exactly how solid this claim actually is, because it's the single most repeated fact about Ward in the popular press today, and also the single most unverifiable one. There is no direct documentary evidence that Johnny Depp, screenwriters Ted Elliott and Terry Rossio, or anyone else involved in creating the character ever specifically drew on John Ward's biography. Depp himself has described basing his performance primarily on the musician Keith Richards, with a dash of the cartoon skunk Pepe Le Pew for good measure, sources about as far removed from a 17th century Barbary corsair as popular culture could possibly produce. The Ward connection is a claim made after the fact, by historians noticing a resemblance, not a documented influence acknowledged by anyone who actually built the character. It may be true, it's a genuinely fun coincidence if it's just coincidence. But it belongs, honestly, in the same category as so much else about John Ward's afterlife, a good story, repeated often enough and confidently enough that it started to feel like settled fact, when the truth is really that nobody can say for certain at all. What we can say for certain is this: a fisherman's son from a small Kentish town, born into a life that offered him nothing but nets and salt and a fair chance of drowning in obscurity, ended his life instead as one of the wealthiest, most notorious, most sung-about Englishmen of his entire century. Sober, comfortable, still quietly supporting a wife he'd left behind decades earlier, tending a clutch of incubating eggs in a courtyard 600 miles from the coast, where he'd learned to gut his first fish. Close your eyes for a moment and go back to where this whole story actually began. A burning deck between Cyprus and the Turkish coast. 3 hours of chain shot and smoke, and a carpenter's quiet warning that his crew would not fight much longer. That afternoon made Ward's fortune, and very nearly unmade him entirely, and everything that came after it. The desertion, the drowned 400, the refused pardon, the conversion, the courtyard, the chickens, the plague grew out of those 3 hours the way an entire life sometimes grows out of a single decision made under fire. Whether or not Hollywood ever actually borrowed his name, John Ward earned his own legend the old-fashioned way, by living a life so genuinely improbable that 4 centuries of pamphleteers, playwrights, balladeers, and eventually historians simply couldn't stop retelling it, each one shaping the story a little further from the man and a little closer to the myth, until almost nothing was left of the actual fisherman except the smoke, the gold, and the very last, very quiet detail that somehow survived every single retelling intact. He never stopped sending money home. Go back, for a moment, to where we started tonight, a burning deck between Cyprus and the Turkish coast, chain shot tearing through rigging, a carpenter turning to his captain with the news that his crew would not fight much longer. That was John Ward at the absolute height of his power, 4 years removed from a stolen 25-ton bark, still believing, in that overconfident season of his life, that he might really become the sole commander of the seas he once joked about being. It took the rest of this story, the drowned 400, the refused pardon, the sober old man reciting rhymes about donkeys and owls to a curious Scotsman, the courtyard, the eggs, the plague, the unmarked grave, to show you what actually happens after a moment like that. Not triumph in the end, just a long, strange, unfinished kind of survival, stitched together out of one difficult choice after another, most of them made by a man simply trying to stay alive one more season in a world that had stopped offering him any safer options a long time before he ever fired a shot. Somewhere in Kent, that unnamed wife kept receiving money for years after her husband's name had become a household word for piracy itself, never knowing, we can only assume, quite how to explain to her neighbours where it came from. Somewhere in a Tunis courtyard, a clutch of eggs sat warming under the patient attention of a man 3 governments had once wanted dead. Somewhere in London, balladeers kept singing about a drunkard who had, in fact, gone stone sober years before most of those songs were even written, the legend outrunning the man so completely that nobody singing it ever thought to check. That gap between what got sung and what actually happened is the truest thing this whole story has to offer. History rarely hands you a clean villain or a clean hero. It hands you a fisherman's son who built an empire on other people's cargo, funded it with other men's suffering, and still, through all of it, never once stopped sending money home. You're warm right now. You're safe, in a room that isn't rolling with the swell, under no one's flag but your own. Whatever John Ward actually was, pirate, admiral, husband, convert, chicken farmer, ghost story, footnote in someone else's movie, that part of the story is centuries closed. And this part, the quiet room you're sitting in tonight, is still yours to keep. You're warm. You're safe. Tonight, that's enough.